Good morning, everyone. I am really glad that you all are able to be with us this morning as we have one of our first UK and Kentucky Horticulture Council sponsored Christmas tree programming that the state has seen in a while. We're really excited for the response that we have seen from everyone. It seems like there's a lot of new growers in the state and a lot of demand for Kentucky grown Christmas trees, which is just really exciting for the state of Kentucky. So thank you for being here. I just want to remind everybody, if you can, to please make sure that your mic stays muted the entire time. And also please try to keep your video off as well. Also wanted to remind people the webinar does go from 9 to 1 today, and it will be recorded. So after the meeting is over, everyone will receive a link to the recording, and you can go back and watch it as many times as you need to. If you missed something or just want to rewatch it again, it will be there for your viewing. Before we get started with any speakers, though, we're actually going to launch a couple of poll questions for you guys. Cindy's going to launch those for us, and they're just a few questions to kind of get a sense of who is out there, how long you've been growing Christmas trees, where you're at, and things of that nature. So when those pop up on the screen, go ahead and give those a quick answer if you don't mind, and we'll share the results and look at those. Okay, poll is up. So go ahead and answer those. There should be 3 questions. We'll review the results after we close the poll. So we do have 5 speakers today in the webinar. The first one will be on business planning and budgeting. The second one will be on weed management. Then we have a general getting started. We'll be talking about site selection and site preparation, planting techniques, things of that nature. One on species selection and specifically looking at how Phytophthora root rot can help make your decision in what trees you want to grow. And then we'll also look at fertility and nutrition management in Christmas trees. So good lineup today, speakers from all around the Eastern US who are experts in their field. And then we'll also have a break in the schedule from 11:15 to 11:30. So if you want to jot that down for yourself, you will have a break to get a snack, use the restroom, whatever you need to do. That'll be from 11:15 to 11:30. Also, as we go throughout these sessions today, please feel free as questions come up, and I know they will, go ahead and drop them in the chat box at any time. And when the speaker is done speaking, hopefully we'll have a few minutes for questions and we can get to some of those questions and have a discussion with the speaker. And if there's just a whole lot of questions out there that need to be answered and we don't have time, we will follow up with the speaker and we'll get an email sent out that will be a part of that follow-up email after the webinar. Last thing I want to mention before we close the polls, and again, if you haven't answered those poll questions and you still want to, there's 3 questions there to be answered. Go ahead and do that. Last thing is we also may add some resources to the chat as we go through, so be sure to monitor that chat and copy and paste those links into something where you can save those for yourself later and go back and reference. And then last thing, we also will have a post-event survey that we will drop the link in the chat at the end of today's webinar. If you can follow that link and then fill out that survey, that would really help us know how today's webinar was and also help us basically plan future programming that is centered around what Kentucky growers need. So, all right. Cindy, I think we're probably good to go ahead and close that poll. All right. Are the results up?
They should be. So
okay.
Do you see them there?
I see them now.
Okay.
Okay, so it looks about half of you are not growers, but maybe you might be extension folks or other technical assistance type people. We have about 20% that looks like you're pre-commercial, maybe thinking about starting in Christmas trees, or you have a plan to get started this fall or next year. And a lot of you who are already growing. So a good mix of folks. This is good. All right, it looks like a lot of us are in central Kentucky, Also some folks in East and West Kentucky. It's good to see people from all around the state. And then what type of operation? We have a lot of chews and cuts, pre-cut on-farm sales. Doesn't look like we have any wholesalers present today. It looks like we do have a question about what is pre-commercial. So what we're identifying pre-commercial as is folks who haven't really gotten started yet, but are either thinking about it or who have plans to get started in the next year or so. Hope that makes sense. All right. Thank you for the poll, Cindy. And I think we're good to go ahead and get started. So unfortunately, our first speaker, and he couldn't be here with us in person today, so we will have a recorded session for the first speaker, but all of our other speakers will be live today. Our first one is Lynn Keim. He is from the Pennsylvania State University, and he is a senior agriculture extension associate, and he specializes in economics of specialty horticulture crops, including Christmas trees. So he's going to give us a talk via this recording on business planning and
extension associate with the Department of Agricultural Economics, Sociology, and Education. I hope your conference is going well so far and you are learning some techniques and practices that will benefit your Christmas tree business. My schedule would not permit me being with you today, so we're recording this presentation. I encourage you to begin thinking of your plantation as a business and not just what you do. Farming is a business and it needs to be viewed as a business. So just keep that in mind when you begin planting trees and getting ready to harvest trees. Penn State is a equal opportunity university, so I'm sure the same as University of Kentucky is. And this presentation is titled Business Planning and Budgeting. So we will begin to think of your plantation more of a business as a business and not just again something of what you do. So there's a lot of questions about business planning. Business planning is for everyone and any business. Yes, a Christmas tree plantation is a business. The business plan helps you keep your original goals in focus and provides a sense of grounding for the business. You should never pay someone else to write a business plan for you. I could relate a story for you of why you do not have someone else develop your plan. No one knows all the answers. However, when you have completed your research, you will know the answers to the questions important to your business. Business plans are never completely written, but business plans are never completed, but written with enough flexibility to support the future of your business. You need to revisit the plan every year or whenever a new opportunity presents itself. Business plans have multiple readers and users. Each reader reviews the plan with different interests. The owner uses it as a roadmap. The manager reads it to see why the business operates and how it may function in the future. Creditors want to know if the business will be viable and will be able to repay any funding they provide. Investors or potential investors will try to determine if their investment would possibly pay dividends. So the owner leads the process. As I said before, don't let somebody else write your plan for you. If it's a viable plan, they may wind up doing it and not you. So like I say, keep that in mind. The planning process should involve everyone in the family and or the business. The plan should reflect reality and not what you want it to show. You can make a plan say that everything is all well and good. This business is going to make $100,000 in the first year, but that may not be reality. Make sure that it does reflect reality. The plan addresses the worst case scenario. So you would write your plan, and your financials should depict what you think will happen, what could happen if a disaster hits, and what could happen if the opposite occurs and you do make quite a bit of money on this. Where's that money going to go? Is it going, first thing you should do is pay off debt. And the next thing you should do is put it away for the future, maybe just, to keep the business operational or keep that business. The goals and objectives should be achievable and clear. The plan should be flexible. The plan is reviewed often and revisited at the whenever that dictates. Look at the entire business. The plan will force you to do this. You will be able to discover answers to many of the questions that will arise. It helps develop and solidify the goals and objectives of the business. It will help you prioritize the important aspects of your business, and the plan helps with the daily decision making if a new opportunity presents itself. It may not be part of your current plan, but if something comes up, you may be able to adapt the plan to see if that opportunity is profitable or should be ignored. Your plan will allow you to be proactive and not reactive in business. Many businesses that succeed are always operate more times than not proactively, meaning they set the pace. They do not react to something that happens that they had not already thought of that might happen. As in anything, and this is going to be a little bit into the risk management part, but approach this business plan with a what-if question in the back of your mind. Like I say, being proactive lessens the stress, does not promote reacting to whatever happens. The plan should provide a starting point to benchmark the business in the future. If partners are in the future of the business, they will have something to review to assist in their decision making. As I said before, lenders will want to examine the plan and help determine if they're profitable. Imagine starting a road trip without a map or a GPS capabilities. Starting a business without a business plan is much the same. I've done this before, where you start on a vacation or a trip, having one stop in mind and knowing that you're going to be on the road for several days. It's kind of unnerving for somebody like me that likes to have everything planned out. And it's really, especially if it's a business, it's even more unnerving. So keep that in mind. So the role of planning is you plan, you prepare for the future. And again, prepare with that question of what if. Once you have the plan completed, if the plan dictates that the business will be profitable, then you implement the plan, meaning you start the business. Results, something happens. You start the business and the day-to-day aspects of the business take over. But remember to keep recording what happens on a daily basis. Make sure that you know what happened in each day, and write it down, because memory sometimes does not serve as well as what it probably should. So keep your good records. Records will not only help you currently, it'll help you in the future, because you can look back and see what happened when and maybe why it happened. You may be able to look back 3-4 years down the road, and especially in Christmas trees, 6 or 7 years down the road, and wonder why your trees were not as big as what you anticipated them being, which may decrease their value in the marketplace. If you start to look back through your records and you see that out of those 6 or 7 years, you had 2 years worth of drought and no irrigation on those trees, which most people don't irrigate Christmas trees. But if you had 2 to 3 years of drought, that could have stunted that growth process for those trees within those 2 years, not making them not quite as valuable as they might have been if that had not have happened. And then again, that allows you to evaluate the processes and evaluate what happened, and maybe explain why things are the way they are. So a business is usually structured in this manner. If you think of it as a book, you have the title page, you have the table of contents, you have an executive summary, and your mission, goals, and objectives, background information, organizational matters, marketing plan, a risk management plan, and financial plan. You also may have an appendix section where you add that to it to back up any possible explanations that you may need to provide more detail for. So what is a SWOT analysis? It's an analysis that is conducted with everyone in the family and the business. You're going to spend some time developing that SWOT analysis, but that time and effort will help you establish your goals and objectives. So what you want to do is you want to get everybody together and make sure that it's a safe space for ideas. Have everybody throw out all their ideas about the business and what it may be in the future, why it's a good business, why it's not a good business to enter into, anything that they can think of. You put everything up into on a flip chart or a board or some type of recording document, and then once you have everything have discussed everything, then you start to put them into the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And when you start to group them, you will start to see where things should fall. So strengths are mostly internal. What do you or your team bring to the business? What are the aspects that you have, that you currently have, that are going to support this business? And maybe it's your work ethic. Maybe it's the excellent business team that you put around yourself. Weaknesses, mostly internal. What do you not do well? And believe it or not everybody does everything very well, or not everybody likes doing everything. If you're a typical ag producer, you probably are not going to enjoy the bookkeeping part. And most people in agricultural production think spending time in the office is a waste of time. It's not the fun part. It's not the being outside. It's not the helping to produce the crop. It's the bookkeeping. It's the tedious part. So you may have to hire somebody to do that for you. Opportunities are mostly external to the business. What unique opportunities does the business have? For a Christmas tree plantation, are you close to a major highway, that you can put some signage up and draw people into your operation? Threats, these are also external. What threats what are the threats to your business? And when you start to talk to people about threats, more times than not, that always comes back to governmental regulations. That's just one example of a potential threat that you could probably list for your business. And again, this is sort of what may seem like the frou-frou stuff of a business, but craft a mission statement. It'll help you guide. It'll help guide your business, and it puts you where you want to go. The goals are set from the information from the SWOT analysis, and the objectives are the means to reach these goals. So you set up your goals. Goals have time limits. So you may say, within the first 3 years of my Christmas tree business, I want to plant 2 acres of Christmas trees each year. So that's a goal. It has a time limit on it. You may have to be clearing ground to do something like this, or getting current fields ready for the Christmas trees through soil amendments and that type of thing. So those, having the soil amendments applied, having the ground ready, they would be the objectives to that goal. So it's, it's one supports the other. The objective supports the goals. So, the research tool, you need to know what your competition does to see how you can make your mark in the industry. There's several ways to do it: surveys, focus groups, interviews. And by interviews, talk to some other Christmas tree farmers around you. This may seem a little sticky because, if your neighbor, half a mile away is growing Christmas trees, and you walk up to him and say, hey, I see you're growing Christmas trees. I'm going to start planting Christmas trees next year. What can you tell me? It may not be the best choice of people to go talk to, because that person may see you as direct competition. So, again, you want to know what the competition is doing, but they're probably, if they're a neighbor that is that close to you, they may not want to give up all their trade secrets, and probably will not. So keep that in mind, but do interview some other Christmas tree current Christmas tree growers. They can be a source of valuable information for you. And watching what other people are doing. Learn where they are, find out what they provide. If the neighbor down the road is growing Christmas trees and just, completely wholesaling every tree that they grow, maybe you want to make your Christmas tree operation into a destination. Provide wagon rides, or, whatever other type of entertainment, or, something that attracts the general public to your operation, being, they want to come cut their own Christmas tree. The neighbor he wants to cut everything himself, put it on a truck and get rid of it. Maybe you are the people person of the two and want to do your business a little differently. So, what is the industry doing now? How is it developing? Where is it headed? Especially right now, Christmas trees, live Christmas trees seem to be making a comeback. Back during the pandemic, it was one of those things that, some areas were experiencing a glut on the market. Some areas were experiencing not having enough trees for the market. So, there's a lot of different ways this thing can go. Is there room in the industry for your business? Christmas trees are a long-term investment. You'll have to wait 7 years or more for a return on your investment, depending on your marketing plan. What is going to happen 7 years down the road? If you have that crystal ball that's that clear to be able to see that, I congratulate you, but most people do not see that far down. It can be a daunting thing to sit there and think, well, what happens if I planted the wrong cultivars or varieties of trees? What am I going to be able to do with those once they get, to the point where I can start to cut them? You need to do a lot of research to make sure that this thing is going to go where you want it. The organizational matters portion of the plan defines who is in the business team. It should consist of your attorney, your accountant, your insurance provider, and any other people that important to your business. If you have a mentor, that would be an excellent person to have on your business team. You want to describe the management team, which may consist of just you. It may consist of you and your spouse. It may consist of you, your spouse, and a farm manager. There's a lot of variables out there. Outline the qualities that make you qualified to operate a business. What is your background? What have you done in the past? What makes you think you can do this, as a basic question? You have the drive, you have the knowledge, you have the land. So that's why you think you can do it. And each person's is got to be a little bit different. Like I said, include the family members, as they are critical to the success of the business. If your family is against you starting the business, it's going to be an uphill struggle for everybody concerned. Your family's going to say, well, why can't you come to this event that I'm in? Why Why don't you have time to do this anymore? You know, they have to buy into this business also. If you have a formal business structure, an LLC or a corporation, it needs to be outlined here. And you know, in the appendix, you can put in the articles of incorporation or the paperwork for the LLC to make sure that everybody that reads this plan knows how everything's set up. Is the LLC set up more as a sole proprietor with one stock shareholder, or is it set up with multiple shareholders, more along the lines of a corporation? How are the profits distributed? That type of thing. So marketing is, you know, the 4 P's of marketing: product, price, promotion, and placement. You know, they have a very good idea of where these trees are going or how you're going to sell them before you plant the trees. You really don't want to plant the trees, wait 6 years, and then say to yourself, wow, now I have all these trees. What am I going to do with them? That's really not a good place for your business to be. You tend to be a price taker at that point and not a price setter. I can't stress that enough, is, you know what your marketing plan is, you know, when you start to plant these. Pricing considerations. What are your costs? And, you know, your price should always be based on what your cost is, plus whatever you want on top of that. The other part of it, you know, not all trees are going to be sold as number ones, especially in Christmas trees. You may have some that the trunks aren't straight. You may have some with big holes on one side or the other. They are not sold as a number one. What are you going to do with those number twos? How are you going to market those? You know, what will the customer pay? What image do you want to convey? Do you want to convey the lowest priced Christmas tree farm? Or do you want to convey the best experience for a Christmas tree operation? You want all that public coming to your operation every weekend or during the week just to cut their Christmas tree from you know, on your plantation. You know, what does the competition charge? This is one that, you know, most people will say, well, I want to undercut the competition on price. The trouble is, if they're not making money and you charge less, guess what? You're not making near as much money as they are, and they're losing money. So you're losing more money. Is that what you want to do for your Christmas tree operation? Again, what will a market bear? What are the pricing challenges do agricultural businesses face? What are the things that really make up, you know, what are the things that make up your operation? So there are 3 types of budget. We're going to get into the budgeting portion of this presentation at this point. There's a partial budget, an enterprise budget, and a whole farm budget. We will focus primarily on the enterprise budget because what we want to do is be able to analyze this Christmas tree enterprise. You know, a partial budget, if you're considering that, you know, what new or additional costs will be incurred by doing this? How much will current income be lost or reduced? What new or additional income will be received? What current costs will be reduced or eliminated? Again, the partial budget is something that you may want to do just as a general exercise about this Christmas tree operation, just to get yourself in the mindset of doing a good enterprise budget down the road. They're used for producing, you know, for adopting a new production technology, to change or add enterprises. Again, you know, if you're considering adding this Christmas tree enterprise into your existing farm, what types of things are going to need to change for you to be able to add this type of enterprise? You know, it's used if you're doing, you know, want to hire custom work in, somebody to come in and do plowing or something like that for you. Is it cheaper to do that than it is to go out and buy a larger tractor and a plow, land preparation equipment, the disc, the harrow, and all that kind of thing? Leasing instead of buying machinery, you know, what's the bottom line between the two of those? Modifying production practices, making capital improvements, and this is the thing. It helps you analyze whether that capital improvement is going to benefit the business, or is it going to, be a detriment down the road? A partial budget example is set up like this. It's additional cost and additional income, reduced income and reduced cost. So, keep these things in mind when you're doing something like this. So an enterprise budget, which is what we really want to focus on, is, you itemize the receipts or the income received from an enterprise. And that always goes at the top of your business, of your budget. You list the inputs and production practices required by an enterprise. So all your variable expenses. You evaluate the efficiency of farm enterprises by using an enterprise budget. You estimate the benefits and costs for major changes in production practices. You provide the basis for a total farm plan and a whole farm budget. When you lump your enterprise budgets together, you can come up with an entire farm budget or plan. Again, the income is always on the top, and hopefully that income number is always greater than what the expense number is that is going to be further down in the budget. Your variable costs are listed next and totaled. Fixed costs are on the bottom and totaled. Profit or loss is after the fixed cost. You take those total costs and subtract that from your income, and then hopefully you still have a positive number. I'm working on some budgets currently for a different type of enterprise that I'm really struggling to have that be a positive number at the bottom. The enterprises just are not making much money, if at all. So, that may be a red flag to say, well, maybe I really don't want to start this business. So once you have your income and your total expenses, you can, a break even can then be calculated to see what type of things that you may be able to do, to help this business succeed. In business, there's two types of expenses: variable, which are also called direct or marginal cost; fixed cost, or indirect or overhead. And there's quite a difference between these types of costs. Variable expenses or direct costs are costs that directly related to crop production. They can be easily directly assigned to the production of that crop. For example, fertilizer. Maybe the more fertilizer you put on the ground, the better your crop is going to be, the faster your trees are going to grow. There does seem to be, I would imagine in Christmas trees, a law of diminishing returns. The more fertilizer you put on, maybe the less growth you get, or the more growth that you get that you're going to have to trim off during the summer, to make those trees look how you want them to. Chemicals, seed, harvest labor. Harvest labor is a very, very good example of variable expenses. That harvest labor is the thing that, the more product you produce, the longer it takes to harvest it. Taxes, this would be taxes on employee, on labor, your Social Security portion of the tax, your portion of the Social Security tax and that type of thing. Is something that you would want to keep into variable expenses. Fixed costs are costs that are not directly related to crop production. They cannot be easily directly assigned to a particular crop or action. For example, utilities, school taxes, salaries, family living expense, and repairs. And repairs, by that I mean to buildings. If you have buildings where you have equipment stored, it's repairs to those types of buildings, repairs to roads or driveways throughout the farm. These are the things that don't have a direct correlation between the crop that you're analyzing, say Christmas trees or vegetables. you're going to need the same thing whether you're growing one or the other. So it's that type of expense. It's that one that really is most people have the most trouble grasping, which, how do I calculate those fixed costs? And to do that, there's an acronym, and economists love acronyms, and most universities are also love acronyms. I'm sure Kentucky is not much different than Penn State. And I know we love our acronyms, but it's called the Dirty Five. And it's depreciation. And what I mean by depreciation is the economic depreciation. It's not the depreciation that you list on your Schedule F. It is the depreciation that is due to the wear and tear on the piece of equipment. For example, you calculate depreciation by taking the cost of the item. Say you have a tractor that costs you $70,000. You figure that tractor is going to run for 10 years. Now, according to the IRS, you can take accelerated depreciation and depreciate that tractor in 1 year. Or the maximum for IRS usually allows 7 years on a piece of equipment. We all know that there's a lot of tractors out there that are running past 7 years worth of life. So if you think that tractor is going to last 10 years, calculate that tractor to last 10 years. So the economic depreciation on that would be the $70,000 worth of tractor. And you say, well, when I trade that in at the end of 10 years, I can probably get $7,000 or $10,000 for that tractor. May not be realistic, but just for round numbers, it works. Okay, so you would take that $10,000 off the 70, would make it $60,000. You divide that by 10 years. So your depreciation is $6,000 a year. That's your economic depreciation. Interest on fixed expenses, your mortgage, that type of thing, any building improvements that you may have loans out on. That's where this interest is calculated on. It's not the interest that you pay on your pesticides or anything that, like an operating note, does not get included in the fixed expenses. Repairs, like say, to capital improvements, buildings, roads, that type of thing. Your property taxes are a fixed expense. Your property insurance is a fixed expense. Doesn't matter how many Christmas trees you grow, your insurance is going to cost you the same amount per acre. So take those fixed expenses and put the depreciation aside and take those fixed, the remainder of those fixed expenses, divide that by the number of acres that you either own or rent, and that will give you a land charge. And that way you have a figure that you can assign per acre. You also, always include your annual depreciation in your fixed cost. But that will give you a figure that you can assign on a per acre basis, which is how your budget should be developed, on a per acre basis. If you have, maybe you want to do it on types of trees, maybe Fraser fir as opposed to Douglas fir. You can do that as long as your acreage, you know what your acreage is. But for ease of developing this budget, I would always suggest doing it on a per acre basis. It's something that really gives you a common denominator to be able to compare everything to. So once you have that budget, like I say, then you can your break-even price is your total cost divided by your yield, and that will give you what you need to get for each and every tree to be able to break even on that enterprise. And again, like I said, I know the Christmas trees are a long-term investment. It's going to be really difficult to contemplate those costs that are out there at 5 or 6 years. but you can take your first 2 years, which you can probably make educated guesses or have pretty decent knowledge on those costs for the first couple of years. And then you may want to add just a certain percentage to those each cost for every year after that. Right now inflation rates at about 8 to 10% on most things. Hopefully it goes down from there, but it's something that you really do need to be able to kind of put a value to. I know it's difficult, but use your best educated guess. The other types of budgets that you might need are an overhead expense budget, cash contributions to overhead, a monthly cash flow projection, and this one should be one that you do to help make and add into your financial documents. Do a yearly cash flow budget, meaning you list every month what you anticipate your expenses to be, and what you anticipate your income to be. Now, Christmas trees are most other agricultural products that your income is only going to come within probably 2 months of a year, probably November and December. So you're going to have 10 months worth of expenses before you have a month worth of income. That being said, how are you going to bridge that gap between income and expenses? You may need an operating note. You may need, especially in Christmas trees, you may need an intermediate term note to keep that operation flowing on a yearly basis. Most new businesses fail due to lack of capitalization. I can't stress that enough, because make sure you have enough funding to keep yourself, meaning your family, or unless you have outside income, but make sure you have enough capital invested to keep that business going until you start to see a substantial income. Again, like I say, for Christmas trees, it may be 7 years, or 8 years, maybe 9 years, depending on cultivar. So keep that in mind. Like I say, that monthly cash flow projection with what if scenarios. Again, there's that question, what if? What happens if we have a drought? What happens if things are not the way they should be? Some other financial documents you should draft an income statement. It's revenues minus expenses equals your net income. This is something that your lender is going to want to see, and especially if you're just starting up, it's going to be a projected one. But make sure that they know it's projected. So keep that in mind. A balance sheet. If you've ever filled out a loan application, basically what you're doing there is you're completing a balance sheet for you. It's all your assets. That's everything you own. Assets should equal liabilities, which is what you owe. That's what you owe somebody else, plus your owner's equity. Your owner's equity is the thing that makes the balance sheet balance. It's how much equity do you have in the business? How much equity does the lender have in the business is going to be your liabilities, and how much equity do you have in the business, which is going to be the bottom line. You really want to make sure that you have more equity in the business than what the lender has. And a lender's probably not going to lend you money if you don't have as much invested as they do. They want to see that sweat equity. They want to see how much, what you're going to do to keep this business operational. So keep that in mind. You should have some type of risk management plan. Insurance is going to be one of your top 5 expenses. Your liability, crop insurance. I'm not sure Christmas trees have a crop insurance plan in Kentucky, but something to ask your salesperson. Product liability insurance, probably not going to enter in much to Christmas trees, but life and health insurance, you provide health insurance for any of your employees. Do you have health insurance? What's your cost for that? So for more information, I encourage you to see our Agricultural Alternatives Christmas Tree Production publication. There's also a agricultural alternative on business insurance, ag business insurance, starting a new ag business. It's our one of our websites with new and beginning farmer information as part of it. There's also some publication on budgeting. We also have a publication on developing a business plan. We also have a publication on starting a business. So there's a lot of links here that you can take advantage of down the road. This is also something I really stress that you should download and go through this risk management checklist and user's guide. It's something we put together. The risk management checklist has been out there for years. I've been involved with updating this probably 4 different times. And at this point, I think we have it pretty much where we want it. I don't know if it'll be revised again, but it's something that I really suggest you looking through. And then we also have information on various types of insurance at another website. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I hope this presentation has been helpful to your business. And I really wish, like say, this was live so I could answer any questions you may have. And I apologize for like say schedule just not matching up. So again, I thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Bye.
Okay, so that was a very good session. And like I said, unfortunately, he wasn't able to be with us in person, but we will include all of those links that he had there in his last few slides in the follow-up email that will also include that post-event survey. So be on the lookout. There's a lot of good things that Lynn has been doing in his time at Penn State that revolves, around economics, marketing, budgeting, and all of those sorts of things. So be on the lookout for that. Check those out. And if you have any questions specifically for Lynn, we can ask them for you, follow up with him, and also include those in the email. So be sure to drop those in the chat if something comes up. You can drop them in the chat at any time, even if we're during the last session of the day. So big thank you to him. Our next speaker is Dr. Joe Neal. He is from North Carolina State University, and he is an extension specialist in weed science. Before we actually get him started, I forgot that Cindy, can we launch the poll? We have a couple of pre-session questions for you guys just to get a feel of how you guys are feeling about weed management. If we can get the poll up, we'll have you guys answer a couple questions real quick.
I'm working on it. This
Okay.
is not, I'm having trouble getting the next poll to launch. So give me just a
Okay.
second.
Well, if we can't get it right now, maybe we can hit it at the end of the session. Oh, looks like it's up.
No, it was the one from before. Yeah, let me work on the poll and we'll do it after this session. Sorry.
Okay. That's no worries. No big deal. Okay. So we will go ahead and welcome Dr. Joe Neal. It looks like he's on here with us. And like I said, he'll be talking about weed management and conifer production, pre-emergence and post-emergence. Dr. Neal, it's all yours.
All right. Thanks very much. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, you sound good.
Okay, good, good. Well, let me get to presentation mode here. All right. Well, okay, and I'm not. So I'm gonna title this, weed management and conifer production, because, when we're producing Christmas trees, conifers for Christmas trees, there are a lot of producers that produce their trees not just for Christmas tree sales, but some for ball and burlap production or for live tree production. And we have lots of different species. But I'll emphasize that, you know, my experiences in working in Christmas tree here in North Carolina, we do focus on the Fraser fir production. Now, I do also work on nursery crop production for other species. So if you have questions about production in other species, we can also address that in the Q&A portion of this. So let's get right into this. What do we need to worry about with Christmas trees? Well, the trees are actually more competitive with weeds than a lot of other agronomic crops. So when you look at what are the important species to manage, we have to think about grasses. Perennial grasses and even our summer annual grasses are highly competitive for water and nitrogen and other nutrients. And in small or newly planted fields, of course, the grasses can overtop the trees and shade them out. Tall broadleaf weeds, not only do they shade the crop, they're not particularly competitive for water or nutrients. Might surprise a lot of people, but what they really do is shade the crop and then interfere with your shearing operations and harvest operations. And also vines, of course, will disfigure the crop. But, you know, low-growing weeds, low-growing dicots are actually not that competitive. So our weed management goals are really focused on, we want to reduce competition to maintain our growth and our tree quality. We want to get rid of those weeds that interfere with harvesting, particularly if you're a choose and cut operation. You know, your clients don't want to walk through a briar patch to get to their trees, right? But also, we want to maintain our soil. And a lot of Christmas trees are grown in our mountainous areas. And while you can grow trees very well on a bare ground situation where you maintain that bare ground via, you know, herbicides or cultivation, that obviously leads to problems of soil erosion and degradation of soil quality over time. So when we think about Christmas trees, you really have this continuum of, if you've got tall fescue sod, yeah, the tree will survive, maybe, but it's not going to grow. In bare ground, yes, the tree can grow, but you've got other problems associated with that. But in between those two extremes, we have a wide range of the amount of weed control and weed management that's truly necessary to produce a quality Christmas tree. And that's why, you know, the solution for your farm may be different than the solution for your neighbor's farm or for a farm in another state. And so there's really no substitute for local knowledge, knowing what really works for you, for your trees, for your soil, for your site, for your market. Okay. So I'll be covering what are the basic principles and the tools of the trade. And then it really is important for you to understand what tools are available and then how you might use them, right? So let's start with an overview. We'll start with site preparation to try and get rid of really problematic weeds, and then in-row management with pre and post-emergence herbicides, and talk a little bit about between-row management, right? So before planting, it's really essential that you look at the complex of weeds that are present. So particularly if you're going into a newly cleared field, you get a lot of woody sprouts and brambles, poison ivy, vines, woody vines like wild grape and Virginia creeper. These are really problematic to control after the fact. So again, if you're breaking new ground that was forested, there is a huge seed bank underneath there, but it's not going to be pigweed and crabgrass. It's going to be things like black locust and brambles. So you've got to be ready to control these woody weeds. Ideally, you want to break that ground, give these weeds a chance to emerge, and then control them before you do your plantings. Okay, but too often we're expanding, going into new ground because we need that new ground to plant trees. If that's the case, then you need to be prepared to address these woody weeds in production. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So let's just say, okay, we're ready to plant some new plants. What are the things that we're going to think about? In newly planted stock, the herbicides we use for keeping our vegetative free strips in production really need to be safe on these young plants applied over the top. Okay, so in newly planted conifers, we have quite a few tools available to us for a traditional pre-emergence weed management plan. And, you know, the old standard of simazine plus a dinitroaniline, such as pendulum, aquacap, or barricade, is still an effective and inexpensive option. We have other tools available that, for use at this time, specifically SureGuard, Esplanade, or Marengo. If you have nutsedge or a history of nutsedge in that field, then you could use Tower or Pennant Magnum. Okay, so let's examine some of those. We'll examine some of those in detail in a moment. What's different in an established field is you're often doing directed applications, but you're still using kind of the same tools. You can do a pre-emergence application of a broadleaf product like simazine plus a grass product, make that application in late winter and late summer, spot treat with a post-emergence glyphosate application as needed. If you have thistles, you can come in with a Stinger or Lontrell on an as-needed basis, and focus on your perennial weed control in the fall when those perennial weeds are more susceptible to glyphosate and some of the other herbicides, right? But within that basic plan for newly planted or established fields, our industry is dealing with herbicide resistance, and over 50% of growers have reported that they have resistance in their fields, and this has been expanding rapidly. Okay, and we have resistance in our fields to numerous modes of action. The most impactful at this point in time is widespread resistance to glyphosate. Okay, but we still have simazine resistant weeds out there. All right, so that means we need to step back and say, okay, what are the tools that we have available that we can utilize to build a weed control program that's not relying on a single mode of action, right? For pre-emergence herbicides, pre-emergence weed control, we actually have quite a significant list of species available. Simazine, Gold, SureGuard, Barricade, Pendulum, Pennant Magnum, Tower, Marengo, or Esplanade, Frequency. And for post-emergence, we have glyphosate is still an effective product. There's Goal, and SureGuard is both pre and post, just as Goal is. Frequency is a pre and post-emergence product. We have true post products like Stinger, Lontrell, a few others. And I'll emphasize that Westar is no more. Hopefully you were not using it before, but I know a lot of growers were. But that is no longer on the market and will not be coming back. So let's take a look at each of these in turn. Barricade and Pendulum, I'm lumping them together because those are same mode of action. They're pre-emergence, mainly for annual grass control. They'll control some small-seeded broadleaf weeds, but really do not provide adequate control of the larger seeded broadleaf weeds like ragweed. Might be good enough for lamb's quarters and pigweed. That's a real maybe. Kind of depends on your soil type and the length of your growing season. But normally they're best used in combination with a broadleaf product such as simazine. Pre-emergence control of broadleaf weeds does not control grasses. That's why it's often combined with either Pendulum or Barricade or pendimethalin or prodiamine. And there are generic forms of prodiamine available on the market. There has been resistance, and ragweed, pigweed, groundsel, and quite a few other weeds are resistant to, or can be resistant to, simazine. This was more prevalent in our production fields 30 years ago than it is today, because we have newer tools and different tools available to control those weeds. I think a lot of growers may have even forgotten that they used to have simazine resistance in their field. But if you go back and start using simazine again, the seed of those resistant populations are still in the soil. If you had Christmas trees in that field 30 years ago, there are still viable seed out there. So you need to be aware of that and watch for a resurgence of resistance if you go back to simazine. Now, why would you go back to simazine? Because, I mean, it does have a bit of a shorter residual than others. It is water soluble, and it can leach, and there can be some runoff. But let's face it, it is cheap and it is effective, right? So here's just an image where, you know, it provided very good weed control in our trials this summer. But I want to emphasize that there are resistant weeds out there, particularly ragweed, pigweed, and had this particular farm had a history of simazine use, weed control might not have been this good. But in our production fields, this particular field, this would have been considered too much weed control, because we've got so much bare ground that's going to be prone to erosion. And if we have erosion of a herbicide treated soil, you've also got movement of that herbicide off site, right? So remember that erosion is not just a problem of the soil loss, it's a problem of what goes along with that soil, okay? What else do we have? Well, we still have gold, or, you know, oxyfluorphan. Oxyfluorphan's been registered for use in Christmas trees for many, many years. It provides both pre-emergence and post-emergence. The amount of oxyfluorphan you can use has been reduced due to the re-registration, but it's still available. It's still effective. It does control many of our broadleaf weeds, including horseweed, ragweed, lamb's quarters. There's not widespread resistance to this chemistry. For the pre-emergence activity, it's a shorter residual than others, so you need multiple applications and higher doses, and that means it costs more. Okay, so that's really why gold has not been widely used as a residual in trees, because it ends up costing you a bit more, but it's still an option. And of course, the odor can be a problem if you're in an area where you've got neighbors that might be sensitive or concerned about the odor. The gold tender has a little bit lower odor, but it still has an odor. Again, this is a photo from our trial this summer on ragweed control, and the weed control was quite good from gold. A similar mode of action, or exactly the same mode of action class as gold, is SureGuard, or flumioxazin. This also is a pre and post-emergence product. It provides a longer residual than gold. I think of it as, you know, it's like gold, but with a longer residual and a bit more post-emergence heat. Okay, so again, a bit like gold, it's a little weak on grasses. So often it is combined with a grass control product. So again, this is a photo from our trials this summer for ragweed control pre-emergence, applied pre-emergence. The weed control was very good. In fact, too good for our area where we're concerned about erosion in that field. But on the plus side, where we had an established stand of perennial white clover in the field, the SureGuard did damage the clover, but it did not kill it. And so on the left is that a patch of clover that was in that study that I just showed you in the previous slide. And on the right is another site that had a good solid stand of clover before the application. And you can see the clover has tolerated that treatment fairly well. So, so this is something that we're going to continue to look at in these trials. And I want to say that these trials, these photographs that I'm showing you, and the experiences, and the data that we've used to generate this information has all been done in collaboration with our Christmas tree forestry extension specialist, Jeff Owen, who will be on the program a little bit later today, and the county agents in our Christmas tree production counties. So continuing on, so SureGuard not provides pre-emergence, good residual pre-emergence control of a lot of broadleaf weeds, and may have some a sweet spot of allowing some vegetation to persist. Now, that's something that's desirable in our production systems. If that is not desirable for you, then you've got to come up with some other strategies to manage those perennial weeds, right? What about nutsedge? Well, we do have a couple of products that control nutsedge. Pennant Magnum has been on the in the industry for years. Pardon me just a moment. Sorry about that. A little tickle in my throat. Okay, but Tower is a more recent addition to our assemblage of herbicides that we can use. Pre-emergence control of grasses and suppression of yellow nutsedge. It does not control ragweed or lamb's quarter, so you would need to combine this with a broadleaf product. So, but again, it's a tool for you to use if nutsedge has been a problem in your field. This can be used on newly planted conifers. It can be applied right over the top of the conifers at planting, and but you'll need to come back with a second application because the residual is not a long residual. And I want to emphasize that this is really, it is suppression of nutsedge. It's not 100% control, but it's going to reduce the population significantly if you get that as two applications on. First one before bud break in the spring and weeks before the nutsedge emerges, and then a second application in late spring. Now, that second application is best applied as a directed spray. You want to keep it off any tender new growth. But if you've had a flush of growth that has elongated and matured, then an over-the-top spray, even at that stage, is not injurious. Another new product to the industry is indaziflam, or trade names Marengo or Esplanade. Most likely, if you're in Christmas tree production, most likely you want to use Esplanade, right? This is a different class of chemistry. We use it at very low use rates. It provides pre-emergence, annual grass control, and annual broadleaf weed control. It does, it's been purported to have a longer residual than some of the other competing products. It has some unique efficacy, might have some activity on dayflower. We're still hoping to get some answers on that. But do not apply this when your conifers have active new growth. Okay, we've seen some stunting of the growth when it's applied then, but in general, the way that we recommend the use of Esplanade or Marengo, it should be applied well before trees break bud, because it has this nice long residual. When you look at Esplanade and Marengo, keep in mind that these have different concentrations of active ingredient. They have the same active ingredient and either one can be used, but the dose that you apply is different. Esplanade, 4 ounces per acre, is about the same as 11 ounces per acre of Marengo. So if you start using one of them and you go down to your distribution place and they say, well, we don't have the Esplanade, but we have some Marengo. Remember that your ounces per acre is going to be different. So be cautious about that. Because if you did 4 ounces of Marengo, the weed control is not going to be adequate. If you did 11 ounces of Esplanade, you're probably going to stunt the trees, and that site will have way too much herbicide out there. All right. So this is a photo from our ragweed study from this year at 3.5 ounces of Esplanade from one location. But at a second site, 90% of the vegetation you see within this treated area, and I've outlined that with this box, that's ragweed coming right through it. So we're not really sure why it worked really well at one site and not the other. Different soil types. These 2 fields were in the same county, so they weren't far away from each other. They were treated the same day. So with the same equipment, the chemical coming out of the same bottle. So we really don't know why we got some variable results. So, normally it's a very reliable product. But we have seen occasions where the weeds slip past this herbicide, and so a little bit of experimentation on your farm would be a good thing to do. Now, to that question of does it really last longer? The answer is yes, it does last longer. And in this table, we showed that the half-life. If you look at the half-life of some of our really common products, I don't know, can you see my pointer? Don't know if you can, but flumioxazin or Sureguard half-life is measured in about 20 days in normal soils, whereas the Indazvolam half-life was 150 days. Now, if you look at that and you think, wow, that Indazvolam weed control from that really ought to last a lot longer. But the reality is different. When we've done side-by-side comparisons of these 2 chemistries applied pre-emergence at recommended rates, we find the Indazvolam maybe gives us a few extra weeks of commercially acceptable control. What it does is it gives us many more months of marginal control. Okay, and marginal control is not what we're after typically. So really the commercially acceptable levels of control, yes, it does last longer, but I'm measuring that in weeks and not months. Okay. So just to sort of summarize the pre-emergence products that are available to you, annual grasses, we have annual grass. We have products that control annual grasses very well. We have some products that control broadleaf weeds well, like Simbazine, Sureguard, Goal. We have some products that have like Esplanade and Marengo that have activity on grasses and quite a few broadleaves. But we're still learning about these. So when you think about putting together a pre-emergence program, you do need to think about your grass control, your broadleaf weed control, and whether you're dealing with any Simbazine resistance out there. Also remember that these pre-emergence applications need to be applied in late winter before any of your plants start breaking bud. And if you do that, all of these can be applied over the top. Now, those of you who are using Westar, I get a lot of questions about that. I've never recommended it here in Southern Appalachian production. Just too risky for tree growth, in my opinion. But it was very popular amongst a number of growers. It has been removed from the market, and it will not. My sources have told me it won't be coming back. So some growers have asked, well, can I just use oust? Because Westar was a combination of Velpar plus oust. And the answer is no, you cannot. The oust label specifically says do not apply to Christmas trees. So these products are just off of the shelf now, okay? So for pre-emergence, work with what's registered. But what about after the weeds come up? Well, I'm going to jump right to the summary chart. For after the weeds come up, we have a little bit of a more complicated scenario. Mainly, if glyphosate is still working for you, then okay, glyphosate is great. But when you start to see weeds not being controlled by glyphosate, you really have to think about, glyphosate resistance. And again, I reiterate, probably half of the growers in the country have reported glyphosate resistance already. So, what do we have? I've just summarized based on our work, Jeff Owen and my work and our county agents' work on our most important broadleaf weeds that have shown some tolerance or resistance to glyphosate. We're looking at horseweed, pigweed, ragweed, lamb's quarters. We have products that work. So, for example, 2,4-D-amine controls all of them. Okay, that seems like, hey, that's easy. 2,4-D is cheap, it's effective, but it damages trees if you get it on the growing points. So it can't be used in all situations. Stinger controls some of them and not others. Gold provides some suppression of seedling, but if it gets a little too big, the gold doesn't control it. Same story of Basagran suppresses a little horseweed when it's really small. SureGuard has early post-emergence activity on several of these species, but it must catch that weed when it's young. Frequency is a new product I'll talk about in a moment for post and residual control of some of these weeds, but again, control some and not others. Question marks on glyphosate because do you have resistance or not? That really determines whether glyphosate is effective. If you're going after grasses, what we find is one of the great things about glyphosate, it still works on grasses, but all of these other products are poor to fairly weak on them. So we would think, okay, we'll switch over, we'll use some Envoy or Fusilade or Sethoxidin for grass control. But remember, for annual grasses, they work great. For perennial grasses, they're not as good. All right, so let's take a look at these tools of the trade. Stinger or Elantrell, synthetic auxin. It is selective, controls legumes and asters, like thistles, ragweed, and clover. We don't use Stinger in our production because we want to keep the clover. All right, but if you're not interested in keeping clover, then this is a very effective product for aster weeds, specifically horseweed, thistles, and this is a picture of some ragweed that was treated. Plant doesn't die right away, but it certainly doesn't grow much after the application, right? Limited spectrum of control. And so, in terms of the weeds that it controls, like I said, legumes and asters, but plants in other families are not going to be as well controlled, okay? 2,4-D-amine, good weed control if it's applied before bud break. And here you see some pictures applied before bud break on a Fraser fir. We had no injury. Applied after bud break, you get a little 2,4-D on the new growth and it causes necrosis. Not just twisted and curled growth, but necrotic tissue, dead branches. So you just cannot use this after bud break unless you can ensure that you completely keep it off of the growth of these trees. And don't use the ester formulations. The reason that you can use it before bud break is you don't get the absorption into the tissues. If you use the ester formulation, you break down that barrier and you get the 2,4-D in. So no ester formulations, no crossbow in the Christmas tree fields, okay? Okay, just the 2,4-D amine formulation. And be careful about spray drift because a lot of species, if you got a tomato grower nearby, a little bit of drift can cause a lot of problems. right? SureGuard also has early post activity on these weeds. I showed you good pre-emergence data on that, and I said this is perfectly fine to apply right over your plants as a pre-emergence treatment. But as a post-emergence treatment, yes, it's effective, but it will take the new growth right off of the tree. So if you can ensure you can make an application without hitting the new growth on the tree, then SureGuard may be used. And this is a field where you can see the ragweed on either side of the treated strip. But every one of those trees had all the basal branches burned back. So again, we don't normally recommend SureGuard as a post-emergent spray, because of the damage to the trees. All right. What about this new product, frequency? Frequency is primarily a cool season turf herbicide, and it's used for broadleaf weed control, but it's also used to remove warm season grasses from cool season turf. It's a different mode of action. It's a pigment inhibitor. It has both post-emergence and residual control of many broadleaf weeds, including ragweed, lamb's quarters, horseweed. We have found a little bit of hit and miss on the horseweed control. It does kill clover. So again, in our mountainous areas where we want to maintain clover, this is not an option. The pre-bud break applications, we've not seen any problems with the trees, but post-bud break applications, we've seen some chlorosis in the new growth of the trees. Right. So again, this is quite different than a lot of our other products. And here's just a photo of one of our sites. You can see it took out nimblewill, it took out the clover, horseweed is long gone, but there's a little patch of fescue coming right through that. And the weed control, as I said, in our areas where we're wanting to maintain some vegetation, it was just a bit too much. Now, one of the interesting things we've seen with this chemistry, it also seems to have a little activity on horse nettle. We don't have very many products that are really good on horse nettle, and this is not going to kill the horse nettle, but the horse nettle just stays like this. It turns white, and then it just sits there for a long time. So it might be a tool in your horse nettle suppression program. It is currently labeled for use in conifer production. The marketer has, or the manufacturer has not made a big push of advertising it into our industry. Say that again, or was that my echo? Sorry. But it is currently registered under the trade name Frequency. Okay, there are other trade names for the same active ingredient out there that are not registered for use in conifers. All right, but the trade name Frequency, it is labeled. All right, so when we're thinking about glyphosate-resistant weeds, other cropping systems have just substituted glufosinate and provided control, and you see a lot of reports about glufosinate controlling or being a very effective treatment for control of ragweed in a lot of crops. But those are genetically modified crops to be resistant to the glufosinate, and we've found significant injury to trees from glufosinate, so we just really do not recommend it. Around shade trees, it works quite well, but around conifers where you want those limbs and the foliage down low where you would be doing the applications, you can see that tree on the right that received a directed spray of glufosinate to control the ragweed, but severe damage to the tree, and those branches died. They didn't just turn brown and start growing again. They died. All right, well, those are your tools to develop a base program. but you're also going to have escapes. You're going to have dicot weeds and sedges that are going to require some more individualized attention, right? So one that I've received some questions about recently are the bindweeds. A couple of species of bindweed, but they both respond very similarly to herbicide treatments. The bindweeds are in the morning glory family. The flowers look like morning glories, but they're perennials. They spread by fleshy roots that produce new shoots. And our standard recommendation of 2 to 4% glyphosate by volume applied, basically anytime you see it growing, has been somewhat effective. It's more effective applied late season, say in September, but less effective applied in the spring and summer. But our recent work suggests that 2,4-diamine and triclopyr are more effective. But remember, your 2,4-D and your triclopyr can only be applied while your trees are dormant. That means in the spring. You may get a window of opportunity prior to bud break when these weeds have broken bud and started to grow, or you might get a window of opportunity in the fall while your weeds are still growing, but your trees have set bud for the winter. Okay, so in between, these herbicides can cause severe damage to your trees. What about thistles? Thistles, not that hard to control once you go after it. We have not seen resistant to glyphosate. Clopyralid, Stenarolontrel are very effective, even though they're a little bit expensive. And remember, many of our thistles are actually annuals from seed, and virtually all of our pre-emergence broadleaf products, Simazine, SureGuard, Gold, Gallery, they all work on thistle coming from seed. Okay, so if you've got thistles, you just have to put that on your list of targets that you got to go after, right? Because we have plenty of tools to do so. What about grasses, particularly quackgrass? If you've got that, difficult to, the grasses are generally well controlled by glyphosate. Now, yes, there has been a few reports of some glyphosate resistance out there for the ryegrasses and Johnson grass, but that's not widespread in our production areas. So glyphosate does still work on the perennial grasses. We do have other options, Fusilade, Envoy segment, our post-emergent selective products. They're more expensive to use, requires multiple applications, and they all work much, much better if you catch it at this early growth stage when that quackgrass is only 4 to 6 inches tall. If you come after it late in the season with these herbicides, you'll be very disappointed in the results. You've got to start early. So if you need to use this class of chemistry for grass control, map those areas, be vigilant, and watch for the emergence in the spring and get after them right away. Okay. What about woody weeds that are coming up in amongst the trees? Glyphosate does work, but honestly, triclopyr is better on most of our woody weeds. But again, you've got to be very cautious with triclopyr. Use the amine formulation, not the ester formulation. Okay, it is an auxin. It's good for woody weed control. In fact, foresters and roadside people use triclopyr for woody weed control on roadsides, but never applied over the top. And when trees are actively growing, you have to keep this chemistry off of your trees, completely off your trees, or you'll get some pretty severe injury. Now, how to get it to work? Foliar sprays work in the spring better than in the fall, but honestly, triclopyr works pretty well most any time of year. You can also use cut stump treatments or cut stem applications, where you would cut the woody plant down either with a saw or some lopping shears, and then spray that freshly cut stem. It's got to be done immediately. You can't just cut everything then down and then come back the next day and spray those stems. It doesn't work that way. You cut it and treat it immediately. You can also use basal bark treatments. Normally, that's the ester mixed in oil. Be more careful with that because it's volatile and you can do more damage to your trees that way, right? But that cut stem application is a more selective means of getting rid of the woody plants. Now, cut stems treatments for woody plants is really what we normally recommend, except for tree of heaven. Tree of heaven reproduces by sprouts that come off of the roots. So if you cut that tree down, you actually stimulate all the root buds to sprout and produce new shoots. So it's much better to do a foliar or a basal bark treatment on tree of heaven to get better control. Okay, then come back and cut down the dead stems, but let that herbicide work. Let it get down into the roots to try and slow it down. So one thing always to remember is if you have bare soil, Mother Nature is going to try to fill that void. Okay, our pre-emergence programs, must provide a long residual, make the application in late winter, early spring, before the summer annuals emerge. Come back with another application in certainly in around the 1st of September to control the fall germinating winter annual weeds, the fall germinating biennials and perennials. You may need another pre-emergence application in early summer to get late season germinating summer weeds, but that is a site-specific question. Also, it's a chemical-specific question. So, for example, if you have used SureGuard for your pre-emergent spring, it may last long enough through the summer for you. But if you use Simazine, we found it really does not last long enough. You need another application, typically end of May, 1st of June. All right, so some of these questions are site-specific. Some of these issues or solutions are specific to the chemistry that you're using. And there is no substitute for you trying these products out and seeing how they work on your farms, right? But I will also leave you with this thought. Does your tree really care if you've got some clover and dandelion growing around it? And the answer is no. In fact, there is some evidence to show that if you're growing Fraser firs, you will actually get better tree health and tree growth overall if you leave some vegetation present to hold the soil together, reduce erosion, and to cool the soil. Okay, that's why when you've toured North Carolina Christmas tree production, you see a lot of fields that look kind of messy, right? And we've worked very hard to try and convince growers that this is not a messy field. This is a really high quality ground cover management practice in Fraser fir production. So keep that in mind. It's like, what really is a weed in your production system? A little bit of chickweed in the winter time around an established conifer. It's not going to reduce the growth of that tree at all. Provides a little ground cover that protects the soil from erosion. And if you've got legumes or clover in the field, that actually can contribute some nitrogen to the soil and provide some nutrients to your trees. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions if we have time.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Neal, very much. It looks like we do have one question that we'll get to real quick. Kyle says, any recommendations for non-chemical weed control? Can some amount of weeds and grass be beneficial during droughts by providing a microclimate?
Let me address those, and those are two kind of deep questions, actually. Non-chemical weed control. Okay, first principle to remember, mowing does not reduce the competitiveness of weeds. That, 50 years ago, that was the main practice among growers, was just mow them. We found that mowed weeds are just as competitive as weeds that you did nothing to. So you'll reduce the growth. We saw reductions of growth of 50% on white pine, 30 to 40% reduction of fir growth on firs from keeping the vegetation mowed versus a strip control. Okay, so with that in mind, we know we've got to have some kind of vegetation control or suppression, right? So yes, keeping some vegetation in the field is a good thing. That absolutely is a good thing, particularly from our perspective of maintaining our soil quality. But you've got to be selective about which vegetation you keep, and you do have to suppress it and keep it low and reduce its growth. Now, can you do that with some quote unquote non-chemical means? Yes, you can. And it's more expensive, and you'll have to do it more frequently. So there are, now this is by non-chemical means, that means no chemicals. So you can, do you count propane as a chemical? You can do flame weeding. That works about as well as a contact herbicide. Burn the vegetation down, the weeds will regrow within a few weeks. Guess what weeds are very fire tolerant? Grasses. So that will be a constant problem in that system because grasses are quite competitive. What about organic herbicides? And there are many organic herbicides on the market, and they all work about the same way. They work as contact action burn down products. It doesn't really matter whether it's an oil-based product or a vinegar-based product, caprylic acid based product. These are all contact action materials. That means they're going to burn the tissues and the vegetation that they touch, and they're not going to leave soil residual to keep things from coming back. They're not going to go systemic. They're going to be more effective on dicots than grasses. So again, we're back to that problem, grass suppression. Now, in newly planted trees, you can use mulches. You can use a geotextile fabric mulch, either a row cover or discs around each tree. And of course, perennial weeds can come through those, so you want to prep that field very well and make sure you don't have bindweed, quackgrass in that field before you lay a geotextile fabric down. So it's not good news if you want to go non-chemical or organic, but there are options and they can be effective, but you have to do multiple applications each year. And be careful with them when you're applying them because they're contact action. They will burn the trees if you get it on the new growth. And they're actually more hazardous to handle for the operator compared to our synthetic chemistry. But having said that, yes, you can do that.
All right, that's a good answer. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get to that second question. We also did have another question about Johnson grass control, but maybe I can follow up with you, Dr. Neal, afterwards, and we can get an answer formulated in our follow-up email to all the participants. So thank you, Dr. Neal. That was wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay. Glyphosate, non-void, and a shovel.
Okay. All right. All right.
Short and simple.
Well, sounds good. Thank you very much again for being here. I appreciate it. Cindy, do we want to launch the poll for the next one, or do we want to try to tackle it at the end if we have time?
Well, we can do the quick pre-survey or session pre-planting poll. I'll launch it real quick.
Okay. If you can, we'll leave this open for a quick 30 seconds or so while I introduce our next speaker. So go ahead and hop on that poll and answer it if you feel inclined. Our next speaker is Bill Lindbergh. He is with Michigan State University, and he is a Christmas tree educator up there in the northern part of the state where they have more intensive Christmas tree production. And today he's going to talk to us a little bit about Christmas tree planting and things that should be considered before you start, as far as site selection and preparation, planting techniques, and all those good kind of things. So Bill will have a lot to say to us. Take another 10 seconds or so. Try to answer that poll real quick if you haven't. Cindy, whenever you think it's good, answers stop rolling in. We can close it real quick and take a look at those answers before we let Bill get started.
Okay, we're at about
and
half.
just to remind him.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
We're
Go ahead.
about half. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and I'll show the results just so you can kind of see where people are.
All right. So there's lots of answers on or options on here for what considerations did you make when you were choosing your planting site, all of which are very important. It looks like a lot of people have considered a lot of these, which is good. I'm sure Bill will talk about some of them. And how comfortable are you with this topic? It looks like we have a whole spectrum, so that's good. Hopefully there's something here to learn for everybody. And with that, I will remind everybody this is our last speaker before the break. So after Bill is finished, we'll have a quick break before we get to hear from our last two speakers of the day. So Bill, it's all yours. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Tara. Can you hear me?
Yes, sounds good.
Okay. Let me put my presentation up here. And that's great to know that a lot of people feel fairly confident already about site selection. So let me not able to see where I would start. So that control bar is there. I'm having a little bit of trouble here, Tara.
Can you start from the bottom? There's a little icon right under the picture of, and I think one more over, you should be able to start it from there.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, so again, my name is Bill Lindbergh. I'm with MSU Extension as a Christmas tree educator. The talk I'm giving today is Christmas tree establishment, and what are some things you need to know before you start. So again, thank you for that survey. It looks like we have a wide range. Some people maybe feel very confident, and others maybe not so much. So hopefully we can provide some information to everyone today. MSU believes in open access to all. So here's our policy on those practices. So Christmas tree establishment, the goal for starting a Christmas tree farm is to obviously get your Christmas trees alive, have them survive, and then grow uniformly and quickly, so we can get those trees up and going, and then to harvest in a reasonable time period. So I'm going to give a little bit about a background about the Michigan experience. So I started in the spring of this year, so a little bit new to the industry, but have learned a lot. But in Michigan, we grow quite a wide range of Christmas tree species. We grow firs. We also grow pines and spruces. And then Jeff Owen will talk a little bit later in today's show about the differences between those, but just that's what we do in Michigan. We also have a wide range in soil types. On the west side of the state of Michigan, we're mostly sandy ground. On the east side of the state, mostly heavier clay ground. Both of those areas are fairly flat. And then we go up to a little bit more northern Michigan. We have a little bit more elevation, but again, mostly light, sandier soils. So yeah, when we talk about Christmas tree establishment, site selection is going to be important. So picking a good spot for your farm to start. We'll talk a little bit today about site preparation, what some work we want to do before, during, and after planting. We'll go over a few planting techniques to make sure we're getting our trees in the ground the best way we can. Dr. Neal did a great job about weed control, so I'll just briefly mention some weed control options that we have here in Michigan. And again, try to get you set up for success. As previous speakers mentioned, Christmas trees are a long-term crop. So everything we do now, we're going to have to figure it's going to be taking decisions we make now are going to be with us for the length of that rotation. So whether that's 8 to 12 years, however long those trees take to grow. So if we can kind of eliminate problems beforehand, that's going to be much better than trying to fix them once the trees are in the ground, and that can sometimes reduce our options. The picture on the right here is from a Christmas tree farm in Western Michigan. I took this picture this spring, and I thought this was just a great example of a Christmas tree farm getting started and having quick establishment. So in Michigan, we like to see that there's no weeds in row, so that's bare ground where the herbicide applications are made. And then we have a sod cover for row middles to help prevent erosion and easier for equipment to go through and access. So in site selection, what's a good spot to pick for a Christmas tree farm? So today I'll be talking about some of the soil physical properties, most importantly, water drainage here in Michigan, soil chemical properties, whether that's the pH or the nutrients in the soil, and then topography, a little bit about slope and aspect. The picture here is from a northern Michigan farm. This was a Fraser fir field. And unfortunately, you can see the middle of the field here, a vast majority of those trees have turned orange. They're dying or are dead. So unfortunately, this site was just a little bit too wet for that species. And the farmer didn't do as much prep work maybe as they would like to maybe alleviate those problems. So now they're gonna have to go back through and replant. So I'll talk a little bit about soil physical properties. The main thing in this slide is about soil texture, about the particle size of the soil. So some soils are going to have very big particles. Those would be your sand soils. So you can see the table there on the right gives you the sizes of different particles. The sands are going to be big, the loams are going to be more of a medium, and the clays are going to be very tight together, very small particle sizes. An analogy I've heard of is kind of thinking about it as a sand is a beach volleyball. A loam soil particle is going to be more of a baseball, and a clay particle is going to be more like a golf ball. So that's kind of give you a wide range in particle sizes. And why that's important is because those particles in the case of a sand are bigger, they can't get as close together. So more water and nutrients will be able to drain through. Versus a clay particle is going to be very small, it can be held very closely together. You get a bunch of clay particles all tight, and that will not allow for much water or nutrients to drain through. So in Christmas tree production, a loam soil will be ideal. So kind of in the medium of that, in that description, that will have for adequate water and nutrient holding capacity, but not so much holding capacity that we can be prone to flooding. Unfortunately, the soil texture is what it is. So we're not able to change a sand. A sand will always be a sand. A clay will always be a clay. So there are some things we can do on the kind of the periphery to offset some of those challenges you may have at your site. But just keep that in mind. At a certain point, a sand is a sand and a clay is a clay. Some other things we can do to find out what the physical properties are at your prospective site is to check them ahead of time. And we can use the website Web Soil Survey. That's through the USDA. And that will give a lot of descriptions on the physical properties of your prospective farm. I have a few slides upcoming that will talk about how to go through that site. We can also investigate in person. I also highly recommend that. If we go online, definitely go in person, bring a shovel, get a tractor, do a little bit of digging around a prospective site to see what the soil types are. And that's always very helpful. So this is again, from our Web Soil Survey. So this is through the USDA. If you look that in your web browser, you can find that site. This is actually from my family's farm. Currently, this was a grass hay field. And you can box in the area with Web Soil Survey to give a little bit more information about what your area you're looking at. So the question is, would this be a good site for Christmas tree production? So within Web Soil Survey, you can click on the next tab over for soil map information. This site has almost a huge amount of information available. I'm just kind of touching the very tip of the iceberg on what's available here. But within the Web Soil Survey mapping, you can see we have two soil types, an A and B, which is a gross loamy sand, and on the upper portion here, CHB is a clone loamy sand. So in this, if we go ahead and click on that description, it'll provide us a lot of great detailed information about what this soil type is like, how it's formed, different soil profiles. The important thing from my perspective here on if this is a good site for a Christmas tree farm is drainage class. How well or poorly does this site drain? So it actually is somewhat poorly drained, and then the depth of the water table is fairly shallow, 6 to 18 inches. So not only is it not going to drain very quickly, but also the water table is quite high here. So that may be problematic for some of our Christmas tree species. So I went out to the site after a moderate rainfall and also took some pictures in that soil type of the gross loamy sand. And sure enough, there's a fair amount of water standing and in several spots in this farm. So it would not be my first choice for planting Christmas trees, but if it is a site that, for whatever reason is ideal in other situations, maybe it's very close to a major roadway or population center, then what are some other things we can think about modifying the site if it's a wet, heavy soil or poorly draining site? So again, the easiest thing to say is avoid if it's possible and plant somewhere else. Perhaps you could plant on a different part of that farm where it's not as much of a problem with the water draining. But other things we can do are look at adding additional drainage. So whether that is tile drainage at the subsurface or ditching at the surface, either way to help reduce the amount of water standing in the root zone. Raised bed plantings are also an option. They're not widely adapted here in Michigan, but they can be used. So this photo is from my predecessor, Jill O'Donnell. This was taken from a Christmas tree farm in Quebec. These are, I believe, Fraser fir trees on a fairly wet site, but because they were able to plant them into a raised bed, even just a few inches of improved clearance, let these trees grow and are very well, producing very well. As I mentioned before, we'll learn a little bit more from Jeff Owen about some different tree species and which ones fit in certain situations. But spruces versus firs, one tree may be better. Firs are a little bit more picky. And then specifically, Fraser fir is highly susceptible to Phytophthora root rot. So if you are planting in a little bit of a wetter site, Phytophthora could be a potential issue. You may consider other tree species than Fraser fir. Conversely, if we're on a little bit of a highly excessively draining soil or a very light textured soil, what would that potentially be a problem would be in drought situations. Because those soil particles are further apart, again, the water is going to move through quickly and not hold as much water. So the easiest thing we can think about is if we have a problem with that is like adding extra irrigation. So an image here on the right is from Dr. Bert Craig at Michigan State, but this is a drip line emitter with the emitter running. You can see the water dripping out. So that is maybe the easiest. It's a little bit easier to add water than it is to take it away. We can also think about adding organic matter. So in this image here, the person is adding wood chips around the base of Christmas trees. This will also help suppress weeds, improve soil organic matter, and then give a little bit more water holding capacity as well. Finally, we can think about adding cover crops to our Christmas tree fields. We could do this before planting the trees. Oats, rye, clover are all different options that you could use. You could either spray them with herbicide to kill them or just till them into the soil as a green manure. You would want to give at least a year for that process to occur, for the soil to kind of start to decompose them before planting. And then also topography. So in Michigan, we're a fairly flat ground across the state, but in your area, you may have a little bit more to consider. On highly sloping soils, erosion could be a problem, and equipment access, whether you can even get tractors or implements into the field there. If you are having that as an issue, you can think about, instead of planting parallel to the slope, perpendicular to the slope may be helpful in helping reduce some of that erosion issues. Also consider the aspects, so which way your slope or your hill is facing in addition to the sun. So a south or west facing slope will generally have higher temperatures and less moisture. A north or eastern facing slope will generally be a little bit cooler and have a little bit more moisture. So the picture here on the right is a concolor fir tree. Unfortunately, this species of tree is prone to breaking bud early in the spring. On a south or west facing slope with higher temperatures, that type of tree would be prone to break bud earlier and then be more prone to frost damage. Finally, think about at your site where the air drainage is. So you may have a frost pocket on your farm where there was maybe just a natural lull where cold air is going to settle in. Again, concolor fir or balsam fir is more prone to that early season frost issues. So thinking about that ahead of time can help prevent some of those issues. So that was kind of talking about the soil physical properties. We're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the soil chemical properties. So the best way to learn about the soil chemical properties in your farm is to do a soil test. So I highly recommend doing this at least a year before you plant. What you would want to do is get a soil probe. And how best to take this test is use a soil probe, go out and take between 10 and 15 probes, mix them together in a plastic bucket and send that into your laboratory. The probe depth should be about 8 inches of soil. We want to make sure we're around that because the laboratory is going to base the analysis of this test on our sample that we're sending in. So we want to make it as uniform a sample as possible. We want our depth again to be 8 inches. We want the angle to be perpendicular to the ground, not angled one way or the other. And it's easier to modify issues in the soil from the soil test prior to planting, before the trees are in the ground. And I know it can be challenging because you're so excited to get the trees in the ground. But again, if you can do this prep work ahead of time, it's going to put your trees in the best possible situation to grow and survive. So one of the main things we're talking about with the soil test you'll get back is the soil pH. And that can be a little bit confusing, like what that is. So it's actually just a measure of the soil acidity, or the amount of hydrogen ions in the soil. And why that's important is that it's going to greatly affect the nutrient availability. So even if the nutrients are in the soil, they may or may not be available to the Christmas trees based on what the pH of the soil is. So the table on the right shows different nutrients and how small or narrow the bars are based on the accessibility for trees to access them from the soil profile. So this is going to be really specific to each Christmas tree species you grow. Firs in general, like say Fraser fir, like a little bit more acidic than some other tree species. So for Fraser fir, I'd say a goal of a 6.0 is kind of ideal. For some spruce trees, whether that be Norway spruce or white spruce or Black Hill spruce, we probably the Colorado blue spruce a little bit higher, around 6.5 would be a little bit better for those tree species. So once we get our soil test results in, if we need to raise the pH, we can do that with lime. If we need to lower the soil pH, we can do that with elemental sulfur. The important things to consider are limits and timing on those practices. Some soils might need such a big change in pH, it's not economically or feasible to apply as much product to get those soils in line where we want. And then also timing. The elemental sulfur is going to take at least a year and maybe more, depending on how big of a jump you need to make. So this is just a table you may get back that would help you figure out how much elemental sulfur, in this example, to lower the soil pH. So if we're starting at a pH of 7, well, that's pretty high, and we want to go back to a pH of 6, based on the buffering capacity or the soil exchange capacity, that will come again in the soil test results. They'll give you a range of how much elemental sulfur you would need to apply. And also just important to note, as the soil CECs increase, you might get to a point where it's going to take so much elemental sulfur, it's not going to be practical or feasible to get that soil pH lowered. In Michigan, we generally have CECs on our lighter soil types around 5, so it's not as big of an issue. So on the other side of the spectrum, if we're trying to raise the soil pH, we may start out again at soil pH, let's just say 4.5, and we want to get to a pH of 6. Again, based on the buffering capacity of the soil, that will again be on the soil test report. It'll give you how many tons of lime you need to apply. Other important things to look at in the soil chemical, the soil test report is phosphorus and potassium. So both of these nutrients can be applied to the soil pre-plant, and you can address any nutrient deficiencies. Ideally, once they're applied to the soil, we would incorporate that with some type of tillage mechanism to get those nutrients moved evenly throughout the soil profile. Both of those nutrients, once in the soil, move fairly slowly, so it's okay to get those applied ahead of time. So again, going back to my example slide of this grass hayfield, this is a soil test report that came back from the laboratory as far as how many pounds of both phosphorus and how many pounds of potassium that would need to be applied, transitioning from a grass hay to a Christmas tree field. So I just want to give a kind of a real world example as well of what can happen when our soil pH gets out of whack. So as you can see here, the Christmas trees had turned yellow, unfortunately. And this is a Fraser fir. Trees are fairly mature, I would say around 6 to 7 feet tall. And other part of the field, they look still very nice, a nice deep green color. So what had happened here was the pH was around 6, ideal for Fraser firs. The grower was doing some excavating and had some excess soil from that excavation project, and they decided to fill in some of the low areas of the field, and this was one of the low areas of the field. And unfortunately, the soil pH got moved all the way up to 7.4. So it greatly affected the ability of the Fraser fir trees to absorb those nutrients from the soil. So even though those nutrients are there, the trees just can't access them anymore. And then they're turning yellow. So that was an issue that the grower is going to have to remedy. So we talked about the physical properties of the soil, the chemical properties of the soil. We'll shift gears once again. Now talk about more about planting techniques. The goal overall is obviously to make a slit in the ground or hole in the ground for your tree to sit into and then reburied and then to have it to be able to grow. We'll go over some different equipment options. Just want to leave this thought in your mind of what best fits into your farm. Not every farmer is going to have the same needs or labor equipment use is all going to be different. So just kind of keep that in mind. So all different types of equipment you can use to plant trees, obviously a shovel, a dibble bar, an auger, and you can also use a planter pulled by a tractor. The planter pulled by a tractor is obviously going to be able to put more trees in the ground at a faster rate. Based on your location and how much labor you have, you may be able to use that. The main thing with any one of these planting techniques is we want to avoid J-rooting, and we'll go through this a little bit more detail in the future slide. But if our hole's not deep enough, what may happen when we plant that tree in the ground is we're going to push the roots and they'll eventually curl up at the bottom, making a J shape. That's very problematic for Christmas trees. And essentially the tree will not establish well. It may just outright die or it may just not grow. So make sure our holes are deep enough. Other things we want to consider are the spacing dimensions when we're thinking about planting. In Michigan, 6 foot by 6 foot planting dimensions are quite common. Every 14 or I believe it's 14 rows there is on an alley break for equipment to go through. Obviously, there's trade-offs with planting spacing. The more closer the trees are together, the higher spacing densities will get you more trees per acre and can get you more revenue at the end of the harvest per acre. However, higher tree rates per acre can also lead to more disease issues because the trees are planted closer together. They're not going to dry out as quickly and can get some more insect pressure. And another issue is that you may not get as much spray coverage because the trees are planted so closely together. So there's trade-offs either way you look at it. Again, that might look at if you're a choose and cut farm, that might be another, or a wholesaler. Again, more ways do you need more room for people to walk through the field. Also, just consider field layout when you're starting out. So the image here on the right has a nice driveway going on the left. How are people, equipment going to transfer through the area? So just another thing to keep in mind when you get started. So I mentioned J-rooting. So unfortunately, this was a kind of a sad story here, but the picture here on the left shows a farm here in Michigan. The trees, just as you can see, there's many bare spots. There's many spots where there's no trees at all, and the trees that are here are not growing well. So the farmer told me, you know, I planted these trees 6 to 7 years ago, and they don't look a day different than when I planted them. They haven't grown really at all. So it was kind of discouraging. So we started pulling up some trees to look at the roots and see if we could find out maybe there's an insect or disease pest going on here. But no, it is J-rooted plants. So you can see that kind of classical J shape on that root on the picture on the right. Again, those trees just will not establish. The grower will eventually just probably have to start all over. So just important to make sure when you get started, don't be in too big of a rush. Make sure you get your good planting depth on your hole. So we don't cause that J-rooting on those tree seedlings. So important planting depth, making sure that where we're planting the trees are not too shallow nor too deep. We want to make sure it's good at the ground line with the union between the roots and the stem. It can be slightly deeper than that, but don't go too deep either. Anything too shallow, those roots will be exposed to air. Desiccation and tree death will be occurring very quickly. So you'll know that right away if you plant it too shallow. Too deep can also be a problem if you get too much of the bark or the stem buried. What will happen is that area is not meant to be. It's not a root, it's a stem, and it will rot over time. So it's almost cruel that our trees will grow and establish fairly well. Then over time, those trees will die out, generally right before harvest. So you get quite close to getting those trees harvested, and then all of a sudden they die as well. So making sure we get a good planting depth is important. The next several slides are from a great bulletin out of the University of Missouri. So I'll give them credit for some great graphics on some different planting techniques. So the first one is with the dibble bar. So as you can see, if you haven't had experience with this type of equipment, pushing the dibble bar in, moving it to the left creates a little hole. You can put the tree in. putting the dibble bar in a couple inches away from the tree and then shoving back the other way, then fills in that hole. Important to then stomp in the tree to remove any air pockets, which could cause that desiccation we talked about. This photo here is from Dr. Burt Craig at MSU's crew. They were out planting with dibble bars. Dr. Craig mentioned dibble bars work better on tree seedlings that are smaller because you don't have to get as deep of a hole. If you have bigger tree seedlings, the dibble bar may not work as well. Another we talked about was the shovel. So a shovel method, putting the shovel in kind of backwards to what you normally would, scooping out a piece of soil to make room for the hole, cleaning it out a little bit more, putting the tree root in, and then refilling it. Again, and then using your hole to push out any air pockets. Finally, a grubbing hoe, not super common here in Michigan, but also University of Missouri had that as an example. So again, just could be used very quickly to go through, make a slit in the soil, put your tree in, and then refill it with the soil. So this was kind of our real world example here from Michigan. This is a grower that tilled the soil prior to planting. They applied some phosphorus and potassium, kind of similar to our example we talked about before, and tilled that in. They did that in the spring, and one thing they wanted to mention was if you do till the soil like this, again, on flat, this is a very flat area, so they're not worried about erosion, but also it's good to get a little bit of rainfall after that to kind of repack the soil in. If it's too fluffy and dry, it can actually be a problem when planting. So they're using a tree planter. So just want to go through and exhibit how that would work. It's a piece of equipment that's pulled behind on a tractor. You have a coulter here, a wheel that go ahead and will cut the soil, and then the plow here that will go through and actually create our slit in the ground. The tree seedlings that they have out planting have a wet canvas over them to keep their soils, to keep their roots moist. And they don't bring out all their trees at once, but just what they're going to plant at any given time. From the top-down view of this piece of equipment, you would kneel here on this bar. This is again where the plow is, creating our little trench or slit in the ground. The grower is putting in the tree here, and those wheels coming behind are actually packing in the soil around that tree. So that's an example of a tree planter. Finally, they have a crew of guys going behind the planter, firmly stomping in the tree seedling, pulling to make sure it's at the right depth, make sure they're straight and vertical, not tilted one way or the other. So even if you do have a planter, you still want to make sure you have enough labor to go ahead and make sure those trees are in well. And this is a picture of the right of that finished project, the finished product of the crew going through and planting the trees. This is a picture of I believe is a 3 or 4 row planter. So there's different sized planters that you can look into. I just wanted to include this specifically to show that you don't have to necessarily plow the field up either. This grower is planting directly into an oat field that had a cover crop oat field that had terminated over the winter, and here they're planting in the spring. So that's also an option. So kind of go over planting techniques. I did want to mention too, when you get started, contact your nursery about seedlings and seedling availability. Right now we're in a pretty big crunch as far as demand for seedlings, so there isn't a whole lot of supply out there. So it's always good to call ahead and know what species you may or may not have available. For seedlings, planting time can either be in the spring or the fall. The main thing is to do that when the soil is not frozen. In Michigan, most of our planting is actually done in the spring. The main thing with fall plantings that can be difficult is if you have a heavy soil type, a clay or loamy soil. In Michigan, we've seen that the frost and thawing or freezing of the ground can actually heave the soil and push new seedlings up and out of the ground, and then they have to go through and be replanted. So that's just something to keep in mind. When you do get your seedlings, oftentimes they'll be shipped in boxes like that if you're getting them delivered in the mail. We want to make sure we keep them in a dark, cool place, making sure that those roots are staying moist. You can also store them for a week or 2 in the box is fine. Again, just checking to make sure those soils are moist. You can always add extra water if needed. You can heel in seedlings as well into the ground is an option if it's going to take a little bit longer than that to get all them planted. Essentially, you dig a little trench in the ground and put all the seedlings in together and fill in that trench, and then make sure to water that consistently. Root pruning is also an option. Some growers do this. As you can see here, the picture on the right, this is a gob of trees and roots that were delivered in that package. And then they're going through with a machete and actually cutting off the bottom portion of some of the roots. They're doing this immediately planting prior to planting. The goal of this is to manage that root size. So if the roots are so big they don't feel like they can get a hole deep enough, they're going to sacrifice some of the root on the to manage that size of the root to avoid the J rooting. Some have said that it can spread root disease. So if you are going to go this route, it's not a bad idea to sanitize whatever, in this case, a machete or whatever tool you're going to use between batches of trees. So Dr. Joe Neal did a great job talking about weed control. For Christmas tree establishment, that can be one of the biggest impacts on tree survival, that and the weather, of course. But weeds are gonna compete directly with trees for water, nutrients, and sunlight. So prior to planting, have a plan if you're going to be planting in a field that maybe was an agronomic crop before, or if you're transitioning from a forested area into a Christmas tree farm, what options you're going to use to control those weeds. Unfortunately, the picture here on the right was from a farm that planted in the spring. They didn't really do much to control the weeds prior to or after planting, and they had very high percent mortality of trees in that field. The main goal, I would say, is to maintain a weed-free strip where those tree seedlings are about 3 feet, and then you can have the row middles. So the next picture is here, just an example of that. This is obviously a little bit a really good weed control program here. They have a UTEC tractor sprayer, so that's a specific type of implement you can use, and they went through and applied Roundup in the season to clean up all the weeds that were there. But again, just that they had a nice row middle of cover. In the picture here on the right, I planted some Christmas trees on my family's farm just as something to kind of get my hands dirty and getting started in the industry. So I planted those, put a drip line in for irrigation, added the wood chip mulch. I again do what I say and not as I do. I didn't have a really good weed control program prior to planting, got a little bit too excited, but went through and then used some post-emergent grass herbicide and actually controlled the grasses that were there very well. So it's an option as well, that grass. Unfortunately, this is a picture of a clover cover crop that's kind of gotten out of control. So Christmas tree farm, again, had clover as planting as a cover crop, and then it moved into where the trees are and kind of got out of control. So the girl will have to go through and try to clean that up. Just want to include that, and there's a picture of something to consider. Again, Dr. Joe Neal did a great job on herbicides and different modes of action. MSU Extension also has a bulletin out on weed control for Christmas tree farms. The main thing I would say for trees that once you plant, there are certain lists of products that can be used on new Christmas tree seedlings. The main thing is to make sure that the soil has been settled around those roots. So either by irrigation or rainfall. We don't want to apply a herbicide and have it come in direct contact with tree roots if that's the case. So kind of a summary slide here, but just to kind of give you an idea of timeline of how things should kind of fall together for you, hopefully. So 1 year or more before planning, go out, investigate the site. We talked about how to go to web soil survey, go through that website, learn a little about the physical characteristics of your farm. Take a soil test, take multiple soil tests. I didn't mention that, but that's always a good idea. On different soil types that you know from web soil survey, you can learn a little about how uniform your farm is. In Michigan, we do not have much uniformity. We have a lot of variability in fields. So that's always a good idea to take a couple different soil tests. Get in contact with your tree nursery. You may take a year or more to get on their waiting list. If there are any physical modifications we want to make to the site prior to planting, now is a good time, a year before, and whether that's drainage, whether that's adding cover crops, etc. Weed management, if we want to go through and do a glyphosate or any way to kill down the weeds prior to planting, making sure we definitely control any perennial weeds, which can be really hard to control once we're planting trees. And then the spring of planting, tillage or herbicide again, and then planting, we went over some different planting options, and then weed management. So I guess with that, I'll open up to any questions.
All right. Thank you, Bill. It looks like we do have a question. Somebody wants to know, is there any cover crop that will lower the pH of the soil?
Yeah, I don't know of one that would do that specifically. So that'd be something maybe we could look into a little bit more, but offhand, I know elemental sulfur in Michigan is generally the way we're going to lower the soil pH.
Yes, I will say I've looked into that question myself and haven't found any promising info on that either. Maybe we can ask our fertility speaker later on if they have any viewpoints on that as well. So, all right, are there any other questions that we have for Bill? All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. It looks like we are back on time. I just want to make a quick announcement for all of our UK extension folks, agents that are on this training today. If you can, for you to get credit for your in-service hours, please drop your county and make sure your name is included in the chat. You can either send it to everyone or you can send it privately to me so I can take record of that and make sure everybody gets their credit for being here today. Let's see. I think that was the only announcement that I wanted to make before we take a break. Let's everybody come back a little bit before 11:30. Our next speaker will be Jeff Owen from North Carolina State, and he'll be starting right at 11:30. So we'll see you back then. All right, well, it's 11:30, so we will go ahead and give you another 10-20 seconds to answer that poll if you haven't already. And then while we're wrapping up that poll, I'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker. We have Jeff Owen with North Carolina State University here with us. He is an area extension specialist and he focuses on Christmas trees. So he's going to talk to us a little bit about species selection in the eastern US. All right, poll is closed. It looks like we have a lot of people growing. About half the people that are growing fir species, also a fair amount of spruce species and some pine species as well. In our post-event survey that I'm encouraging everyone to take, there will be a question where we will break categories down a little bit further. So I encourage you to take that survey and answer that question. Let's see, about half of you are somewhat comfortable with species selection and about a third of you are somewhat uncomfortable. Some not comfortable at all and some also very comfortable. So looks like there's a lot we can learn from Jeff. So with that, Jeff, the floor is all yours.
Okay. All right, so are you all able to see my screen okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Let's see, I'm going to shrink the speaker window so that maybe you can see more of my slides. Tara asked me to talk about Christmas tree species. You know, in North Carolina, I spend most of my time working with Fraser fir, so I do get to work with other species, and I was glad to help out today, but you know, I'm kind of a one-horse operation to a great extent in North Carolina. Uh-oh. Let's see, there we go, now we're advancing. Let's see. Christmas tree species for the eastern US. It's really a very diverse crop region to region. A lot of that driven by rainfall and temperature. There are many species to choose from. It looks like many of you are already accessing quite a number, but there are implications for production. I think some of these species have tremendous choose and cut potential and may actually outperform some of the wholesale species that are typically shipped. And while we're talking about trees today, the tree species may be less important than the agritourism strategic planning that you do if you have a choose and cut operation. We talk trees, but it's really about the people. This is a picture of our Eastern North Carolina Christmas Tree Growers Association. And really the decisions that you make as growers collectively are critical to the industry and its future direction. And it's also critical in how you meet the interests and wants of your consumers. I wanted to start out so you understand a little bit of where I'm coming from. Start out with a little description of the North Carolina Christmas tree industry. North Carolina is ranked second in U.S. production of Christmas trees. We're shipping somewhere between 4 and 5 million trees per year. With current pricing and inflation, I estimate our crop to be valued at roughly $250 million a year wholesale, and that doesn't really include the greenery production that's grown as well. About 96% of what we produce in North Carolina are mountain grown Fraser fir, mostly from just 6 counties. But as you look at the US map there, you can see that dark green area in the western part of North Carolina where all our trees are grown. Fraser fir are shipped nationwide. Across the state, we have about 800 Christmas tree growers, and of course, most of those are in the mountains. We do have Christmas tree farms, though, in every county across the state, and some of those eastern farms are very vital and important ambassadors for our industry. As you look at our North Carolina Christmas tree species list, we see a real difference between the mountain region and the Piedmont and coastal plain. And of course, as you move from high elevations in the 2,000 to 5,000 foot range in the mountains, down into lower elevations, we're seeing increased temperature, periods of increased stress, generally milder winters, but the summer temperatures become a limiting factor for some tree species. In the mountains, it's dominated by Abies fraseri or Fraser fir, but then across the rest of the state, it's a full mix. And we can find every species on some farms. Some farms will focus on just 2 or 3. We see Virginia pine, eastern white pine, eastern red cedar, Leland cypress, Arizona cypress, green giant arborvitae, various spruce species. And then there's quite a bit of experimental planting of exotic fir species, and I will touch on that. A little bit more about each one of those species I just mentioned. Virginia pine is a species grown throughout the southeastern US. It has a lot of desirable characteristics. It is a fast grower. Its foliage is characterized by 2 needle bundles or fascicles. The needles can range from about 1.5 inches to 3 inches long. The trees typically hold 3 to 4 years of needles at a time, although you can have some stress years where you may drop down to 2 years of foliage. The trees are dark green in the summer, but they will get more of a yellowish cast at harvest, and a lot of choose and cut farmers will paint the trees or enhance their color. The trees do produce 2 or 3 flushes of growth. That does mean you can get it to market sooner, but it also means you have to prune or shear it 2 or 3 times a year to maintain that good conical shape. So there's a lot of work involved. The branches are strong and good for holding ornaments. The density and branch formation can be a little bit variable unless you're using genetically improved sources of seedlings. And so the cull rate can be fairly high with Virginia pine unless you have a really good seed source. But it is a tough tree that's suited to a wide range of soils and climates. It can grow in the mountains, but typically is grown more in the warmer parts of North Carolina. And you see that same pattern from Virginia to Georgia and on west through Texas. And how it works in Kentucky, I'm not exactly sure, but if you're on a hot site and some of the other species haven't done as well, this would certainly be one to think about. Eastern white pine is actually a little bit more common as a Christmas tree. Here you can see in its natural summer color, and then here you see a row of trees that have been painted prior to harvest, and typically adding that dark blue-green color to the trees. The characteristics of white pine, usually you're only getting one flush of growth per season. Unlike the other species, there's 5 needles per bundle. They're longer than a lot of the other species, up to 5 inches long. They're soft and flexible and fine textured. The undersides of the needles have 2 lines of white stomata that add a whiteness or silver tone to the color. So the tree is often called blue-green or silver green in terms of color. But as with the other pines, they do tend to turn yellow in the fall, and a lot of farmers will paint them. The trees do hold 2 years of needles through the growing season, but generally this time of year when the deciduous trees are dropping their leaves, white pine will drop its older year of foliage, and those internal needles turn brown and drop out. So really you need to have a good cover of current year needles on the outside of that tree. The branch strength is intermediate, so a lot of the white pines will have a lighter type decoration on them because the branches can only support so much. It looks like I made a typo here, but there's more demand nationally for garland or roping than there is for Christmas trees. So there's a huge market for white pine in the greenery industry. And in North Carolina, we see white pine really struggling as we move into our hotter, lighter soils. They just won't sustain. So white pine does really well on our clay soils, but not so good on our deep sands without plenty of irrigation, certainly. In the mountains, we see white pine as the first alternative when we are having problems with Fraser fir. It grows on sites that are too wet for a whole lot of other species. And if you look closely at this picture, you can see the culvert where the little stream is running through the field. And the Fraser fir have all died out and been replaced with white pine that are actually doing quite well. But white pine is also a host for Phytophthora root rot. And sometimes we can actually spread the disease with bare root white pine seedlings that harbor the fungus. And so I think there's a little concern. Sometimes we introduce and spread the disease at planting. But if you're already going into a problem area and not going to be coming back in there with a more susceptible host, it really shouldn't be a problem. And here in this slide, again, you've got the natural fall color in the small non-marketable trees, and you've got the color enhanced painted white pine behind the fence. I've got Scotch pine in here, more of a nod to our Lake State production. Formerly, it was the dominant Christmas tree species grown in the US. Some of you may be trying some Scotch pine. It's a hardy 2-needle pine with stiff branches. My understanding is that it can be quite variable if you don't have a good seed source, and there are seed orchards with improved characteristics for Christmas trees that improve the harvest rate. Some of those orchards may also be looking at pest management issues, and there's a degree of difference in terms of susceptibility to both some of the insects and diseases. We don't recommend it in North Carolina because of the pest pressures and the foliage problems, and the fact that we do have alternatives. But if you want to have a regular fungicide spray program, you can certainly grow a good quality Scots pine. It's not one that we have a lot of experience with in North Carolina. Moving from the pines to the scale needle trees, we have several species in the Piedmont coastal plain that are quite different from the traditional pine or fir. Eastern red cedar was the traditional Christmas tree before there were a lot of Christmas tree farms. The foliage tends to be very prickly with a combination of immature, juvenile, pointy needles, and then the easier to touch mature scale leaf forms. Once they get the scales, those small leaves are about 1/10 of an inch long, and they kind of build in a chain to make the branch. Unfortunately, Eastern red cedar trees often have poor form, poor color. The branches can be quite floppy, and it's not always the best Christmas tree in terms of its characteristics. But if you have that tradition, and Kentucky may have that similar history as North Carolina, I think it's a good one to have on your farm if you're doing choose and cut. You don't want all your trees to be Eastern red cedar, but having some for those that remember the smell, remember the characteristics, it's what they grew up with. It's not a bad tree to have. It does dry out very quickly, and so it's not really suitable for shipping as a cut product. So typically it's not grown for wholesale. Kind of the next generation of scale needle trees is Leland cypress. We have a lot of production of Leland off the mountain in North Carolina. You can see across these pictures, it's lovely branch texture, kind of a feathery appearance. It's actually a cultivated hybrid of Monterey cypress and Alaska cedar. There are a number of different Leland cypress selections. Leighton green is the one that a lot of our growers typically are using for a Christmas tree. It has a very bright green color, and in some light, and later in the season, it gets almost silver green, and is really pretty. The branches are very upright and have a feathery appearance. As with Virginia pine, there's 2 to 3 flushes of new growth per year. So you have to go back out and shape it up. Usually there's one pretty aggressive shaping per year, and then the cleanup shaping is a little easier. We do have a couple of growers using knives, but most of them are using the Beneke gas-powered weed eater with the modified head to prune tree branches. It grows best on well-drained soils, but it does have some adaptability in where you can plant it. I think what's even more important than the soil, you really do need good air drainage, because if you can move some of that moist air out of the field, you'll have less disease pressure. The canker diseases are limiting for some growers. Most growers are maintaining a spray program. We also have growers that are fighting bagworms, which is a pretty consistent problem. Now, the advantage of Leland is it's a fast grower, and we've got, depending how hard you prune on it, you can harvest in little as 3 years. 4 years is probably more typical. But that's a fast turnaround on a 6 to 7 foot Christmas tree. As with the other scale leaf trees, it does dry out quickly after harvest, which limits its market primarily to choose and cut. Now, if Leland cypress was the second generation, green giant is maybe our third generation in North Carolina. It's an arborvitae. It's similar in appearance to Leland cypress. Its branches tend to be that flat spray, but they may be oriented horizontally or a little more vertically. It is not a host at this point in time to the canker diseases that are plaguing Leland cypress. So really that disease pressure is why growers are turning to green giant. However, a lot of the arborvitaes will naturally turn a reddish brown in winter. And in southern states and eastern North Carolina, usually that cold weather comes late enough to where the trees have been harvested and set up in people's homes and decorated, and you don't have to worry about the trees turning that reddish brown. But if you're in a place where early freezes could be a problem, I think there might be some current concern about having the ideal color on green giant. But, you know, we were painting other trees, it can be painted as well. The market for Christmas trees is there. There's probably an even larger market for green giant as an ornamental tree. Arizona cypress is one that's been grown in North Carolina for several decades. It's a naturally pyramidal tree that doesn't require a huge amount of pruning. There are more than 30 different ornamental cultivars. Most of our Christmas tree growers are using just a couple types to grow as a Christmas tree. They both have silvery green to gray blue foliage, which makes them stand out on the farm. They have upright branches, but with more of a rounded orientation to the branch rather than the flat sprays. So they do look a little bit different from the other scale leaf tree species. Now, we could have a good argument about the fragrance of the Arizona cypress. People that are trying to put it in a positive light will say the tree has a citrus or a mint smell. And maybe for some people that's the case. For others of us, it smells like a skunk or cat, you know, so it hits people different ways. But it's very drought and heat tolerant once established and has done well in our eastern NC farms that are often very difficult places for trees to grow. For a long time, we thought it was disease-free, but as more of it's been planted, we find that it does get some of the same problems as Leland cypress, but maybe not to quite the same extent. So again, growers are resituating new plantings to areas that are that have good air drainage. And as with the others, it does dry out, so it's predominantly just a choose and cut tree. Although with that beautiful foliage, we're seeing it used as an accent in some greenery products. And here we're showing Carolina sapphire, which tends to be a little bit more to the gray-green color. And here are a couple of pictures of the blue ice variety that really are a startling light blue. I'm not going to talk a lot about the spruce trees. There are more than 50 different species of spruce that are native to our northern forests around the world. A lot of them are very popular in the landscape. There are numerous cultivated selections for the landscape. They have a natural conical shape, many of them. The branches may droop with the size and age of a mature tree, but are quite upright when you're talking about a Christmas tree sized tree. But the real issue that I have with all the spruces is their needle retention. And it's really led to, in my opinion, a shrinking market share. Even when you're harvesting them late for choose and cut, they have difficulty maintaining needles all the way to Christmas. So, you know, it's one of those trees where sometimes you get away with it and they still look good at New Year's, but then a lot of times they're already dropping when you put presents under the tree. So I think there is opportunity to develop genetics that have excellent needle retention. We saw some real differences in some of the work we did. But right now, for most of the plants that you buy, I think beware of their needle retention. I do see use of spruce trees increasing as one of the containerized tabletop trees or smaller potted Christmas trees that are basically a floral arrangement in a pot. They can hold up better that way because they're intact with their roots, but they're not necessarily going to survive in the yard or landscape the following year after being in the house at room temperature in the middle of winter. The spruces, however, are generally more adaptable to different sites and climates than true firs. And we do see spruces grown almost all the way across North Carolina, even into some of our upper sand hills. But as you move to the hotter temperatures, we do see the spruces drop out. I saved the best for last. Fraser fir really has become a dominant wholesale tree across the nation, native to North Carolina and Tennessee. It's now being grown in at least 26 different states across the northern tier of our country. It has a pleasing aroma, dark blue-green foliage. It has a natural Christmas tree shape that, yes, is enhanced by correct pruning and shearing. And the branches are strong for holding ornaments. It really has all the characteristics that folks expect out of a cut Christmas tree. And the most important one of those is excellent post-harvest needle retention. And there's several of us that have done a lot of work on that over the years. And this was a study that we did in 2019, and we had different treatments, but this was just a comparison of our check treatments. So we had 4 species of spruce, Blue Hill or Black Hills spruce, Colorado blue spruce, Norway spruce, and Serbian spruce. And then we also had Canaan fir, concolor fir, and we had 2 clone types of Fraser fir. We had clones with the worst Fraser fir needle retention and Fraser fir clones with the best needle retention tested out of our clone bank. And what you see here is rather poor needle retention at the top of the chart for all the other species. The bright green line represents the poor quality Fraser fir, which held its needles better than the other species. And then down at the bottom of the chart, you have the best Fraser fir clones that actually held up well all the way into January. So even the worst that Fraser fir represents was better than the other species that we tested. Now, this test was done in October, which is relevant for wholesale shipping, but the trees would perform better when harvested around Thanksgiving. But it does indicate the kind of difference that we see between Fraser fir and the other species. However, Fraser fir is very site selective. The trees are native to elevations above 5,000 feet. We grow them commonly in North Carolina from about 2,000 feet up to as high as 4,500 feet. And even in North Carolina, we had mixed results. You see this picture is a pile of Fraser firs that died from root rot. And the farm is no longer in Christmas trees when I drive by it. In this county, it's now being used to produce hay. Our site selection is driven by Phytophthora root rot specifically, and we see problems with high clay content. We see problems with shallow soils, and definitely issues with too much water. So when we have 3 years with excessive rainfall, we know that even on our good sites, we're going to see more root disease. We do see growers substituting Fraser fir with Canaan fir or grafted exotic fir rootstocks when they know that they've got a marginal site that's likely to have a higher water table. I wanted to just mention a little bit more about Phytophthora because it is such a driving force with the true fir species, as well as some of the others that I've talked about. As a fungus, it's complex. It has multiple life stages. It grows as a mycelium in the roots and bark of the roots and tree, and also extends out into the soil. And it has a couple of spores. One can swim to the growing root tips of the trees, moving through soil water. And then it's got another spore that's thick-walled and can survive for years. And then when tree roots grow near it again, the fungus can respond to the root exudates when the trees are stressed and losing liquid from the roots, and when there are flood conditions. Unfortunately, we do an excellent job of spreading the disease. It moves in soil, so if we're not careful, we move the disease with our tillage equipment on the tires of our trucks and vehicles, and tractors, even on our hands and shoes and hand equipment like shovels and dibble bars. We can spread it with irrigation, with contaminated water. The picture I have here shows flooding and surface runoff related to some culverts from the gravel road on top of the farm. Of course, one of the main sources of disease is contaminated or infected seedlings and transplants. So really tightening up that entire system is critical. Once the trees are large, we can get sideways spread through root-to-root contact. There's a lot of difference among fir species and even among species of Phytophthora root rot. Most of our focus in North Carolina has been on Phytophthora cinnamomi, and that was what this test shows in the chart. A level of 4 is the death of the seedling, and we saw 100% mortality of Fraser fir and Canaan fir. Korean fir did a little better, Nordman even better than that, and we saw some real positive results with Turkish fir and Momi fir. Unfortunately, the two species that are most resistant to Phytophthora, Momi fir and Pindro, the seed's pretty much not available. So it forces us to look at those tree species with intermediate resistance, and there are quite a number of them, many of them from the Mediterranean area between Europe and Asia. We've got Turkish fir and Trojan fir, both from the highlands of Turkey. And so these species represent the hope for Phytophthora resistance among fir, and hopefully we can bring that into Fraser fir and maybe some of the other species in the future. But at this current point of time, we are working our way through with Phytophthora problems. This is a small farm just off the mountain from North Carolina, still at 2,500 feet. A lot of the fir that you see are Canaan fir, Turkish fir, Nordman fir. Some of the trees are Fraser fir grafted onto those different rootstocks. The only Frasers are at the very highest points of the field where Phytophthora hasn't yet spread. So here's a small farm that's continuing to succeed. with planting exotics and using grafted Fraser fir. When you really get down to tree species selection for your farm, site selection is fundamental. And what are those limiting factors for each species? For some, it's going to be early bud break and spring freezes. You know, the higher the elevation, the source of tree seed, the more likelihood is that it's going to get damage because it breaks bud too early at lower elevations. Other tree species, you've got issues with summer drought and high temperature, and the true firs just aren't going to do it. It may not even be the fungus. It's just too hot in the summertime. And as mentioned, we've talked about clayey soils and precipitation and root rot. That's a whole complex of site issues that tie into poor survival. A lot of the cedar and cypresses, you really need good air drainage to minimize a lot of the canker and needle cast diseases. And for any one of these tree species, there's a number of insect and mite pests that you're going to have to be able to control. And you might be inclined when you're starting out to try to do this with just a cheap sprayer from Tractor Supply. But I encourage you all to think about getting professional agricultural spray equipment that will do the job well. And this slide shows a true fir that's just been hammered by a spring freeze. And, if that's what you planted, it can be absolutely devastating. So this is a little bit of a summary. These are the typical tree species that I see being used through most of the southern US. A couple of pines, white pine and Virginia pine, the scale needle trees that we talked about. Leland cypress is still predominant, but green giant is oncoming as a major new planting. Arizona cypress provides interest, but not a dominant planting. Eastern red cedar, kind of that traditional tree. I see some spruces being used, but again, you've got to be careful with that Achilles heel of poor needle retention. One I hadn't talked about was Myers spruce that has more of a soft touch to the needle without that painfully sharp point. I haven't even really talked about Douglas fir. I know Doug fir is popular in Pennsylvania and the Lake States. Maybe it'll work in Kentucky. We don't have any growing in North Carolina because of the disease pressure. I wanted to just briefly mention a couple of points about planting stock. You can trim roots, but very often the health of a plant is related to the balance between the top of the plant and the bottom of the plant. And you really need to avoid high shoot to root ratios. Those roots support the top when you're in drought stress. Also, if a plant isn't healthy, send it back or get a correction. Don't put it in the ground. Make sure you look at your seedlings and transplants in terms of the root system. They should be light colored and healthy with no dark or black slipping bark on the roots. If you have a lot of white root tips, that's a really good sign. And look at the top of the tree for insects and mites and scales. And these pictures that I show here relate very much to identifying Phytophthora on young trees in the field, where you've got the discoloration coming up the bark, dead lower branches, and slipping roots if you look underground. And if you put this on your farm, it's there forever. So it'd be better off to throw a bad seedling out to begin with than introduce it to your land. And you can buy a lot of planting stock, but we have growers that are producing their own. In North Carolina, we're moving largely to container production to avoid the issues with root rot in soils. And you can see a big operation with uniform plants, and you can see a smaller operation with both rooted cuttings and grafted stock and straight seedlings. So I've talked about a lot of different species, but Fraser fir is still kind of the holy grail with a 15-year cycle. It's a complicated tree to produce, and it has a full range of annual and cultural management practices. It's an expensive tree to grow. So, you know, you may want to grow it, but is it always the best thing? And I've got a fairly detailed analysis of some of the income potential, but the bottom line with Fraser fir, you could generate $40,000 to maybe $45,000 per acre. You know, wholesale prices have jumped a lot, but there's still a limit when you think about wholesale Fraser fir. When you think about choose and cut, you're looking at retail prices instead of wholesale prices. And then you're also looking at some species that have a much shorter rotation. I think there's potential to generate as much as $100,000 per acre off of an acre of Christmas trees. That's generally on North Carolina spacing, where you're at 5 by 5, more trees per acre. But then you look at a tree like Leland cypress that grows so quickly, and you can get 2 crops in the same amount of time it takes to grow 1 crop of Fraser fir. So there's the money. It may not be the most popular tree, but there's the money in terms of production. Of course, thinking to our first speaker, this is just a partial analysis, not a full financial plan for your farm. The other thing to keep in mind, if you don't have the right site and you can't grow Fraser fir, you can buy Fraser fir. Most of our eastern growers also sell pre-cut Fraser fir they bought from the mountains. And it's a way to have trees on your farm and build customer base before yours are actually ready to sell. I think I'm getting down to my last slide here. The choose and cut market has been steadily increasing over the decades, and I think it's sheltered, if not completely immune, from the vagaries of the wholesale market. So while the wholesale growers are crying, choose and cut farms keep selling trees. There are different drivers, though. It depends on your local economy. You have different levels of competition depending on how many farms there are locally. You also compete with local retail lots that come in late. You can offset some of these things with a good tourism campaign. And if there's several farmers that can work together, or you've got a good tourism board, you can see a real boost to the local economy as people come to buy Christmas trees. And of course, some years you just don't get the right weather, and you get bad storms on the weekends, and that can really hurt. You know, I wanted to just mention that there's a lot of different right sizing to consumer demand. As we look at Eastern North Carolina, a lot of our farms plan on selling about 500 trees, but a lot of those farmers are retired. They don't have major ambitions to be a huge operation. In the mountains of North Carolina, we've got quite a few choose and cut operations that are selling, you know, 1,500, 2,000 Christmas trees. But when I look at operations in the Northeast, that's where I see 80-acre choose and cut farms that are harvesting 9,000 trees a year. And, you know, what it comes down to, a lot of growers have told me that, you know, and this is a direct quote, my wife and I paid off the house and farm, and we sent our kids to college with our Christmas trees. And I've run over time a little bit, but any questions?
All right. If you've got any questions, Jeff,
Let's see.
drop them in the chat.
Tara,
looks
you're
like
breaking up a little bit.
No. Is it any better?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay.
Are there
All
any
right.
questions?
Let's see. I don't see any questions in the chat.
Well, I'm available, and Tara, you're welcome to share my email address if anyone has specific questions. And I assume
right.
you've recorded this, so good program, Tara.
Yes, yes. All right.
Hi,
Thank you
Jeff.
very much. I appreciate you coming and speaking. Somebody said hi.
That's me.
All right. All right. Well, let's move on and get our next speaker up and ready. Cindy, do you want to go ahead and launch the poll? We have a pre-talk poll here, last one of the day. So go ahead and take a few minutes to answer that poll, and I'll go ahead and announce our next speaker. So our next speaker is Dr. Bert Craig. He is with Michigan State University, and he is a professor in the Department of Horticulture. He is going to be talking to us a little bit about nutrient management for Christmas tree production. All right.
All right, Tara, I think I need to be enabled to share.
Oh.
Very good. My name is Mindy. I'm going to get your ID started. And then
Right. Dakota, Bethany.
You should be a co-host now. You should be able to share
All right.
screen, no problem.
Oh, there it is. Okay.
Okay,
No.
perfect.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go ahead and share the results real quickly.
Yep.
Okay. Let's see. For some reason, the polls wanted to act weird on my screen. All right, got it. Okay, so the question was, have you submitted a soil sample? That's a very important place to start when you're thinking about planting an area in anything, especially when we're talking Christmas trees here. So it looks like about a third of the people who have submitted soil samples submitted one through UK Extension, and about 2/3 of you haven't. So let's hear from Dr. Craig and how important submitting a soil sample is, and some of the things we need to know about Christmas tree fertility. Dr. Craig, it's all yours.
Okay, and I'm going to get this poll out of the way. Yeah, so thanks for everyone for hanging on. This is usually the point in a beginning grower program where people have run from the room screaming at this point. There's a lot to learn, and we're really just, giving the highlights, trying to point out things that people need to know, start getting you familiar with some terminology and so on. So there's a lot to learn. One of the things that I have done, as soon as my slide will advance, is there'll be some resources. Usually we do this at the end, but I'll go ahead and do it now. There'll be several resources related to nutrition that will go out. Tara's going to send everyone an email with some resources from the program here. And there's several things that I'll be referring to as we go through, so you can go back to some things and look at these. One is we do have, and shameless self-promotion here. We do have MSU has a Christmas tree webpage, and we have news on there. You can sign up for alerts. And so I know Bill Lindbergh was on earlier. Bill's been doing quite a few articles and things, particularly directed at new growers. So there's some, I think, be some good resources in there, as well as some tables and figures and things like that you can refer back to. I would encourage you, if you're interested in this at all, we do have the Great Lakes Christmas Tree Journal. This is the publication for the Michigan Christmas Tree Association, but we now cover, I believe it's 12 or 13 states, basically from Minnesota to Maryland. And so we cover a broad area, a lot of topics. And again, we're putting out more and more information directed at new growers. This is the latest issue. You'll see second one down, how to speak Christmas tree. I've started kind of a series of articles, just sort of the terminology, right? We throw around a lot of terms when you go to meetings, and what are they talking about? A dibble bar, they're talking about, DAP and whatnot, what are they talking about? And so there is kind of a lingo. And so we kind of go through, help kind of demystify some of the terminology that we use. So that's a resources out there. If you contact the Michigan Christmas Tree Association, I'm sure you can get on their mailing list. You know, obviously it's a subscription. It comes out quarterly, but very good magazine. We're very proud of that. I'm going to refer to some things from the Pacific Northwest. Now, obviously conditions are different, and Jeff was pointing out, you know, things that go on down in North Carolina. This is a very good guide. It's comprehensive. If you really want to get in the nuts and bolts of plant nutrition, Christmas tree nutrition, this is a great guide. There are some specifics out there. They have issues. Their pH tends to be low. Not a problem we tend to have, and things like that. But in terms of understanding the thought process, the dynamics, that's really a great resource. And there's a link there. It's I think a 60-page guide. It's very comprehensive, very good way, more in terms of the approach and how they're looking at things in managing nutrition. In academia, we tend not to like to advertise for private outfits. However, Spectrum Analytic has done a very nice job with their Christmas tree guide, fertilization guide, and I would encourage you to get this and use this. I think the link you'll see, I think they make you register. It's like submit your email, you're probably on their mailing list, whatever. But it's a great guide. And again, we typically don't, advertise for private outfits. I'm not endorsing them by any means, but a lot of good tables and useful information that you can refer back to. And I refer back to quite a bit in this guide, a good one-stop sort of shop for information. So with that, let me just go through, and I know I've got limited time and really just trying to hit a lot of highlights and get things on your radar that you need to think about. And the first one is, why do we spend so much time talking about this? You talked about weed control, you talked about tree selection. Those are obviously critical things when you're trying to get a farm going. But fertilization's right up there as well. And a couple reasons for this. One of it, it's one of the most important tools you have for managing your crops. When you think about it, what do we have at our disposal? We've got species selection, we've got irrigation, we've got pruning, we've got, pest management, and then fertilization, really in terms of the growth and quality of your trees, is really foremost among those factors that you have some control over. And it's also one of the most common sources of problems. So I'm an extension specialist. I've been doing this for 20 something years. And, at least half the calls, if not more, of the calls I get are nutrition related in some way or another. When people have problems, oftentimes it's a nutrient problem, and sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not. The smoking guns are less common than not. So sometimes it takes a lot of detective work to figure it out. Grower efficiency, you just saw Jeff giving some numbers on costs of production. Fertilization is essential. We're going to have to do it at some point for most Christmas trees during the rotation, often multiple times. And if you haven't paid attention, cost of urea has been on a roller coaster. In fact, the roller coaster has gone back up. Prices have tripled from where they were just a few years ago. And so this is a huge expense for many growers. And obviously you want to make the best decisions you can to get the best bang for your buck when you're doing that. The other one, and one we tend not to think about, but I think you need to, is the environment. And so, when we deal with pesticides, they smell funny. We know there's some potential environmental impacts there. We tend to view fertilizer kind of benign, but really when you think about nitrate in groundwater, nitrogen, phosphorus movement into surface waters, we have a tremendous potential for impact, especially if your farm is anywhere near surface water or groundwater. There's tremendous potential for impact. And so we want to be putting out what the trees need and no more, right? And that's a key thing we want to keep in mind as we're going through this. As I said, whatever I have here, half hour, 35 minutes, it's really hard to do much more than scratch the surface, but I really want to get you thinking about developing a nutrient management program or plan. How am I going to approach my nutrition? What am I after? What's my resource? Start with the soil test, the survey you had. Know your resource to begin with. Where am I starting from? Can I head off problems before they start? Okay. And so things you really need to know when you're thinking about nutrition and growing a quality crop. One is soil properties, and we'll talk about soil physical properties and soil chemical properties. Some of this may take you back to your high school chemistry. Sorry if there's flashbacks, but these are things we need to talk about. Characteristics of the species. Jeff just gave you a lot of information on that. And one of the things that species vary in a lot is their tolerance of either low fertility or also soil pH. And it's better to plant the right tree out there than to try to push water uphill. You're going to be fighting a losing battle if you don't have the right species out there for your conditions. And then what's gone on in the past and what are you doing now with your fertilization, and how do you want to look at that moving forward? Kind of a requirement if we're going to talk about nutrition, we have to talk about essential elements for plants. I don't know how much plant biology folks have had here on the program, but if you look at plant tissue, so you take some needles off of a fir tree or a pine tree or an arborvitae, whatever it is, you dry them up, you send them into a lab, they can analyze all the elements that are there, and they can tell you what all is in there percentage-wise, all of that. If you do that, there's probably 30 to 35 different elements that will show up in plant tissue. But scientists have determined over time that there are really about 16 or 17 elements that are essential for plant growth. So in other words, if a plant doesn't have these, they can't complete their life cycle, can't grow, okay? So we divide these up in what we call macronutrients and micronutrients. And so macronutrients are those elements that are needed in the largest amounts, and then microelements are those that occur in relatively small amounts. Sometimes you hear them called trace elements, micronutrients, but they're essential. Plant won't grow if it doesn't have them. So don't think they're not important just because they come in small amounts. They're still needed. How much is needed of each of these? Well, if you do a foliar analysis, you take tissue, get it analyzed, get the results back from a lab, the macronutrients, those things in the left-hand column, will come back in a percent. So for a Fraser fir, you might get 1.6% nitrogen, 2% nitrogen, maybe 1% potassium, something like that. The micronutrients, in contrast, will come back in parts per million. And it could be very few. If you do something like copper, you might see 6 parts per million, and that's plenty, nothing to worry about. That's all they need. So that's the difference between the macros and the micros. We've listed carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. I don't know, depending on your screen, you might pick up the color. Those are in green. Why is that? Well, because those elements are actually coming from water and the air, right? So the plants, they're not coming from the soil itself. They're not mineral elements, as we would call them. Everything else on that list are what we call mineral elements and things that you need to account for in your nutrient management, in your fertilization program. Most soils, in general, are pretty good at supplying nutrients. Micros typically aren't a problem except in certain situations, and we'll talk about those. Most field soils, unless you're especially sandy or something like that, usually have enough of the micros there that typically aren't a concern. Maybe in certain cases in your local people may know about those if you have them. The other elements there, the macros, oftentimes we do need to add, particularly nitrogen. So a lot of our focus on fertilization is going to revolve around nitrogen. And nitrogen is an interesting case because nitrogen is very dynamic. It's constantly changing forms in the soils. So we break down organic matter, it's mineralized into nitrate, into ammonium, and then that is nitrified into nitrite and then nitrate. And so it's always going through these different forms. Once it gets to nitrate, it can be leached and lost. And so when we talk about soil testing, which we will here in a second, one thing you'll notice on a soil test is you don't see nitrogen. And you're thinking, well, wait, I thought they said nitrogen is the most important element. And it is, but because of its dynamic nature, if you take a soil test, by the time you sent the soil test in, got your results back and could do anything about it, all the nitrogen in that field has already changed forms and some of it may already be lost. And so we look at nitrogen in terms of plant need, mainly size of the tree and the species, okay? The other elements we do want to base our additions on soil tests, and we'll go through those. So phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, those things we'll base off of our soil test and soil test recommendations when we look at those. So let's talk more about soil because that's ultimately the resource that we're managing. And so we want to look at soil properties, and we divide soil properties into soil physical properties and soil chemical properties. And there's lots of interaction between the two, and we'll talk about that. We can talk about lots of soil physical properties, but the two that you really want to pay attention to as you're getting your soils tested and are looking at these things is soil texture and soil organic matter. Okay, and these are both critical. Soil texture is percent sand, silt, and clay. So hopefully you're aware that that's what soil is made of. Sand is the largest particles, then silt, and then clay. And so what your texture analysis will give you is the percent that's in each of those fractions. So you send your soil off to the lab. They have a procedure. If you've ever been to a soils lab, we did this back in class in the day. It's like the old-fashioned milkshake blender. You put the soil in there with some water, a little drop of detergent to keep things in suspension, and then you let things drop out. They measure specific gravity, and the sand drops out first, and then the silt. And you measure specific gravity at each point. You get the percent sand, percent silt. What's left is clay, right? And so this is important because it's going to affect all of our other soil properties, right? The percent sand, silt, and clay affects drainage, water holding capacity, nutrient holding capacity. All of these things are going to revolve around soil texture. So if you don't know your soil texture, you're really fighting an uphill battle. So again, percent sand, silt, and clay. Sand are the largest particles, obviously, then silt, and then clay. One thing to point out on this representation here, we tend to think of clay as just being little particles of silt, but it's really more than that. Clay is really the chemically active fraction of our soil. It's the part that's going to help to retain nutrients. Sand and silt, you can almost think of them like little glass beads. They're basically chemically inert. And we have growers here in Michigan who grow seedlings who grow in basically pure sand. We have beach sand along lakeside of Michigan here by Lake Michigan. And they're growing bare root seedlings, so they like the sandy soil because it's easy to lift and dig seedlings. But on the other hand, they have to irrigate constantly. They have to fertilize multiple times in a season because that soil has such a low nutrient holding capacity. It's almost like a soilless culture at that point. So beware of that. So when you get your percent sand, silt, and clay, then we can determine what our soil texture is, or soil type is. And you'll usually hear it described as a sandy clay loam or silt loam, something like that. So a loam soil is something that has a mixture, right, of sand, silt, and clay. And that's what we want. The clay is going to give us our chemically active fraction, going to help retain water, going to help retain nutrients. The sand, the silt will give us drainage, porosity, the things we need, right? Roots need air as well as water and nutrients. And so ideally, you'd want to be somewhere in that loamy range, usually sandy loam range is ideal. We can grow trees in heavier soil, but you have to be careful with what species you selected. And I'm sure Jeff went through a lot of this in his presentation, especially as we get into soil drainage and, does the soil retain water, which obviously has lots of implications for Phytophthora root rot, as he was alluding to. So physical properties, our soil texture is really the critical one there. The other part of this is soil pH. So a lot of our issues that we see with nutrients are not necessarily that the soil doesn't have enough of that nutrient, it's that not enough of that nutrient is available, and often times that's related to the soil pH. The other important soil chemical property is cation exchange capacity. And so what we need to understand is that all those elements that I showed you that are essential for plant growth don't occur in their elemental form. For example, plants don't take up nitrogen from the atmosphere as N2 gas, right? 80% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. Plants would never be nitrogen deficient, right? But they need to take it up as either ammonium, which is a positively charged form, or nitrate, which is the negatively charged form. So they take it up as a charged form, either a positively charged cation, or in a few cases, a negatively charged anion. As it turns out, a lot of the elements that give us trouble, iron, manganese, potassium, calcium, all tend to be the cations. And so the cation exchange capacity is an important parameter to keep an eye on as you're thinking about managing your nutrition. So we talked about pH. Oh, it looks like it moved my chart around there. Sorry, I switched computers here and it moved my scale there. So understand the soil pH is a measure of acidity. So it goes from 1 to 14, 7 being neutral. Most plants do best on the acidic side of neutral, so 6.5. If you didn't know anything else, you'd say for most plants is an optimum pH. Your soils lab, if you send in a soil and want to get a liming recommendation, they will target pH of 6.5 unless you tell them different. So know the pH requirement of your species before you send that testing, because they're going to default to 6.5 as the target pH. I put on there the formula for pH. I said there'd be some flashbacks to high school chemistry here. And why do we worry about that? So it's the inverse log of the hydrogen ion concentration of a solution. Good God, you know, why is he talking about that stuff? Well, I put that on there to remind people that it's a logarithmic or exponential type of scale. You think about earthquakes on a Richter scale, right? An earthquake of 6 is 10 times as powerful as 1 is 5, right? And it's similar with pH. So if you go from a pH of 7 to a pH of 6, that's 10 times as acidic. If you go from a pH of 7 to a pH of 5, that's 100 times as acidic. And I point this out because oftentimes it seems like a small deal. Well, you know, the plant wants to be at 5.5, but my pH is 6.3. That's pretty close. Well, that's actually a pretty big difference, and the plant will probably tell you. So it's good to pay attention to that, because relatively small, and I'm talking maybe a half unit pH difference can oftentimes be the difference between plants looking great and plants not looking very good at all. So just keep that in the back of your mind, that those relatively small differences in pH can actually end up making a large difference in how the plants do. Why is pH so important? It's like, that's like all these people ever talk about. Well, a lot of it has to do with nutrient availability. Remember, I said that you can have plenty of a nutrient, but it's not available because of the pH. And so for most plants, that 6.5 is sort of the target range. When you look at this, across the top is soil pH, that scale on the very top of this chart. And then the relative size of all those different bars with the nutrients labeled is the relative availability of that nutrient. And what you see is there's a few nutrients that decrease as pH goes up, and then a few that decrease as pH goes down. And so that 6.5 is kind of the sweet spot for where most nutrients are most available. Now, a lot of our conifers have evolved in areas with relatively low pH, and so their optimum are actually a little bit lower. Where Jeff's from in North Carolina, where Fraser fir is native, the pH can be as low as 3.5 or 4. And so it's adapted to very acidic conditions. That's why we usually say 5.5 is kind of a good target pH for Fraser fir. Okay, this is, and again, I don't know what all people are going to be trying to grow down in Kentucky. I saw Jeff talking about, you know, Arizona cypress and Leyland cypress and things like that, and maybe those are the species you need to go with. I would think certainly Canadian. You could probably look to people in Ohio and West Virginia and places around you like that would probably be some good guidance as you're looking for species to grow. What I've listed here are some common things that we grow. In Michigan, we grow a lot of different things. But most of them, if you look at those numbers, you know, the optimum pH is going to be in that 5.5 to 6 to 6.5 range. Generally speaking, we can get pH too low. We've certainly seen where people have over-applied sulfur. We'll talk about managing pH in a moment, and have run into issues with pH being too low. But for the most part, our bigger issue is pH being too high, and we're often trying to drop it down. So let's think about that and what we do with elevated pH. One of the things you'll see is chlorosis. Most nutrient problems and other problems, unfortunately, as well, often manifest as chlorosis, right? Because when you think about it, we haven't talked a lot about what these nutrients do, but if you think about, for example, nitrogen, what does nitrogen do in the plant? Well, nitrogen is in all of the amino enzymes, all of the enzymes, so all of the different biochemical processes that are going on in the plant involve nitrogen. That's why it's the element that's needed in the largest amounts. But it's also part of the chlorophyll molecule. Magnesium is also part of the chlorophyll molecule. So if either of those elements is deficient, one of the things you're going to see is going to be chlorosis. So the yellowing like we see in these plants here. Manganese is a cofactor in a lot of enzyme reactions, so it can result in chlorosis. Iron is not in chlorophyll itself, but it's in the pathway that synthesizes chlorophyll. So that can result in chlorosis. So a lot of these things will end up with a yellowing. So what do we do here? So here's a soil sample. So we're trying to grow Fraser fir what do we want for our pH? Well, if we're growing Fraser fir, we want our pH to be 5.5 to 6. Okay? And if it's much above 6, and again, remember that exponential scale he was talking about, you get much above 6 and you will start to see trees look off color. And the tolerance tends to go down as other factors are off. So if you have a relatively heavy soil, which Fraser fir didn't necessarily like either, then the tolerance for that pH being out of range tends to decrease, if that makes sense. If you have a lighter soil, you might get away with it, but if you're on a heavier soil, you probably won't. So here's what we get when we get a soil test, and I'm going to try and see if my pointer option will work here. I'm going to do a laser pointer. I hope you all can see this. I've got a red dot there. And so what we're looking at here is soil pH is 7.2, okay? So we're past neutral. We're to the alkaline side of neutral. I also want to look here at my CEC. We didn't really talk about different ranges of CEC, but CEC, if you're in a very sandy soil, CEC would be in the single digits, 4 or 5. We have some of that. West Michigan, we've got growers that grow in pretty much pure sand. You get a little clay in there, you might be in the teens. If you have a very heavy soil, you might be in the 30s, okay? So this is kind of a medium light soil here. So this is good because it gives us the potential to make some changes. If our pH or if our cation exchange capacity gets too high, then our ability to change the pH decreases. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But this is a case where we could probably do something. And so one of the things we could do is we can lower our pH by adding sulfur, okay? Now, a lot of people think it's simply a chemical thing. I take H2O plus S gets me H2SO4, which is sulfuric acid, and now I've lowered my pH. Not that simple. It's actually, it's a biological soil microbes that act on the sulfur that lower the pH, okay? And so it takes time. So this is good if we can do this pre-plant and get it working, incorporate it, get it working, and then have it help drive down our pH, okay? The other thing is always better, the best solution is always match the plant to the site, right? So if you know you've got a pH of 7, let's look for something that could tolerate that. Concolor fir, blue spruce, something that is going to be Scotch pine, something that might be a little better tolerant of that. So talking about adjusting pH, one of the things that's interesting and will somewhat unique with growing Christmas trees is if you go out and use Google adjusting soil pH, 95% of the information you're going to get is going to be about liming and raising pH, which we occasionally need to do in Christmas trees, but for the most part, we're trying to keep it down. And so it's a unique thing that we have to deal with in growing Christmas trees. So we're often interested in reducing pH. The agronomic guys are constantly trying to raise it. Okay, and so one of the ways we can lower pH is by adding elemental sulfur. And so this is just to show you, this chart is based on a target of 6.5. We probably want to go lower if we're growing Fraser fir. Let's put that right here, but this is just for the example from kind of a standard reference. And so from the bottom, they're trying to go from 7 to 6.5 and then from 7.5 and so forth. So trying to go from a higher pH to get down to their 6.5. And you see, as you do that, you've got to add more and more sulfur, right? This makes sense. The bigger change you're trying to make, the more sulfur you're going to have to add. But the other thing you need to pay attention to on this, the other part of this table is our soil texture, right? Remember we said, what are the critical things you need to know? Well, one of them is texture. And this is why, because the clay, the heavier fraction of that soil is going to act as a buffer, and you're going to have to add more, in this case, sulfur, in order to affect a change in your pH. Okay, so you need to know not only what's my starting pH, but also how much we're trying to change. Because you can get to a point, and certainly as you get into a more clay soil and maybe CECs, some would say in the teens, maybe in the 20s, certainly where you're going to have to add so much sulfur, it's just not going to be feasible, right? You're starting to add tons of sulfur to the acre. That's probably not going to be a reasonable thing to try to do. And now it's really time to start thinking about growing other things. We can also drop sulfur by fertilizing, or drop sulfur. We can also drop pH by fertilizing with ammonium sulfate, and that's commonly done. Use that as one of your nitrogen sources, and that will also help to drop pH, and this kind of gives you a relative acidification potential of different things. They always list aluminum sulfate. I don't know why. I'm not sure anyone actually use that. Use the elemental sulfur or ammonium sulfate are the materials that you're going to use. Fertilizing with urea will also tend to drop pH over time, just not to the extent and not as fast as fertilizing with ammonium sulfate or adding elemental sulfur. Already mentioned about CEC, so cation exchange capacity is based off of your clay fraction and your organic matter. And it's an index or a measure of the relative ability of your soil to retain nutrients, particularly those that occur as a positive charge. So things like potassium, iron, zinc, copper, calcium, magnesium, manganese, a lot of our elements. So having a good CEC is helpful. Difficult to change to a large extent. We certainly don't want to be trying to add clay to our soil if it's a low CEC, but adding organic matter, either by tilling in, manures if you have them available, or by growing cover crops during fallow times and then disking those in, are certainly ways that you can help to boost your organic matter. Helps with your water holding capacity as well, but especially to hang on to your nutrients. Oh, here was my slide. I thought I'd already shown this. So different CEC ranges that you might see in your soil. And it's good to know this because it's going to affect how your soil is going to change if you need to try to lower your pH, or if you're going to try to lime and raise pH. In that case, that's also going to be impacted by your cation exchange capacity. So get used to seeing those on your soil test. Just go through some examples looking at what we need to do in terms of determining the need for fertilizer. One exception to what I'm about to say is nitrogen. So we know that nitrogen is not going to show up on a soil test. And so what we do with nitrogen, and I'll show you some nitrogen recommendations here that MSU has put together. We typically don't recommend nitrogen right after planting. A couple reasons for this. One, the seedlings usually have pretty good nutrients in them when you plant them. We are concerned with potential for fertilizer burn. So if you concentrate fertilizer around the base of the seedling, those fertilizer prills, ammonium sulfate, urea, these are basically salts. Okay, they're gonna absorb water, and so they can cause an osmotic stress in the seedling. The other thing is it's very difficult to get the nutrients where the roots are. So you're fertilizing a lot of ground, but if you look at how much of that area is actually occupied by the roots, it's pretty small. And so you're fertilizing a lot of area that doesn't have trees, that is either going to be leached, or worse, you'll be fertilizing the weeds, right? And so we typically don't recommend fertilizing at planting. Start the year after, and then increase your fertilization over time as the trees get larger, okay, for nitrogen. We've got some rates for that. Everything else we want to base on one of the things that you see here. And our best option is to fertilize, potassium, phosphorus, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, based on soil tests. Okay, look at your soil test, look at the recommendation. That's what you want to be basing your fertilization on. Pre-plant is optimal, especially for if you do need to lime, and occasionally we do, and especially for phosphorus. So for both lime and phosphorus, those are going to be relatively immobile in the soil. So if we have to come in later and our pH is too low and we need to raise it, or if our phosphorus is too low and we need to raise it, the problem is once your trees are established, what's your option? You can only top dress. You can't incorporate. There's no way to disc that in once the trees are there. And lime, it's estimated, moves down about 1 inch per year. So if your pH were off and you were liming, and same thing with phosphorus, if you think your roots extend down by the end of the rotation, your roots might extend down 10, 12 inches. Well, it's going to take 10 or 12 years for all that material to reach down through the root zone, right? So phosphorus, liming, get the test done pre-plant, make the adjustments, till them in, okay? Potassium too, all these things. Anything that's lacking at the time of planting, fix it before you start, okay? Get it incorporated, get it where the roots are going to be, and it's going to be much more effective. So we can also sample post-plant. We want to see how we're doing. Is our pH staying where we thought it should be? Are the nutrients staying where we thought they should be? And then can we make an adjustment as we're going? Visible symptoms, oftentimes is a troubleshooting mode. Okay, what element is lacking? Sometimes we can tell, sometimes we can't. Soil tests can help, but oftentimes we need to start doing foliar testing and actually looking at what the nutrients are in that sample. Okay, soil sampling is critical. You need to do it. I saw the poll there. Kudos to the third of you that are doing it. Those of you that aren't, you're going to save yourself a lot of headache if you start on that, especially looking at your pH, looking at your major elements, pre-plant especially. Do this before you even start, and it's going to save yourself a lot of headache. So here we go. Pre-plant, site assessment, and then troubleshooting. Once things are going, and then maintenance. How are we doing? So soil analysis is going to give you the macronutrients and some micros. Some will give you things that are maybe toxic, aluminum. The challenge, it may not tell you what's available. That's why you have to look at the pH as well. But most soil samples, if you're getting the nutrients, will also give you the pH. Here's an example. We're looking at a soil test. This one, soil pH 6.1, probably okay. If we're growing Fraser, we might want to drop it a little bit. Organic matter is 0.5%. That's very low. CEC 3.6. That's very low. This is probably like a blow sand type of condition. So we're going to have to really watch our nutrients. Here it's giving us the optimum ranges and then what our actual sample is for our major elements here: potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, calcium. Here's some of our micros: borons, very low, manganese, and zinc. Work with your different labs, see what kind of output they give you. And what works for you. This one's very nice. It gives you this sort of graphical representation, pretty easy to see. Phosphorus is low, my boron is low, and then it gives me the recommendation. Now, calcium carbonate, it's assuming I want a lime because the default is 6.5 for the pH, right? And this was 6.1. If I'm growing corn, yeah, I probably need a lime, but I'm not. I'm growing Fraser fir, in this case, Douglas fir, and I need to lower it. So this is one case where you want to make sure you know how they're basing their recommendations. Give me some recommendations for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Okay, saying to add boron. Boron is a situation, it can be deficient in certain cases, but you need very little. So the recommendation here, we're talking about half a pound. So think about a half cup measuring cup over an acre. That's how much boron you're going to have to add. So make sure it's in something that's a blend that's cut down so you can easily spread it over the area that you need. I'm going to go quickly through here. I know I want to leave a little bit of time for a couple of questions. So let me just kind of go through other things you might want to look at. Visible symptoms. These can often be a challenge as you're growing. First of all, what nutrient is it? Many nutrients can cause similar symptoms. There are things that are not nutrient problems that can look like nutrient problems. How do we sort that out? So do some detective work. What part of the plant's affected? Is there evidence of water stress? What's gone on that might not be nutrient that could help you sort of do the detective work and process of elimination, narrow down what this is. We do encourage, especially when you're in troubleshooting mode, to do foliar nutrient analyses. I'm sure the Kentucky lab will do that. Certainly private labs will. A&L lab, Spectrum, Lee's Waters lab in Georgia. I think they're also in Kentucky. And you send tissue to them and they will give you, an analysis of what's in the needles themselves, and you can help to sort that out. If you can, it's good to standardize. Oregon State did a lot of work on this, and you can see things vary across the season. For conifers, we like to sample early to mid-fall, right about now, probably a good time, maybe even a little bit earlier to get your nutrient sample so that you're always getting them at the same time of year. And especially if you're in kind of a troubleshooting mode, sampling good versus bad plants is always a good way to go, because then you can line up the nutrient analyses, and oftentimes the element that's causing you the problem will show up from that. Be aware that nutrient demand is going to change over time, And so when you're doing your testing, especially your soil sampling, pre-plant is really the critical one. We want to do that. Mid-rotation, maybe once you're about 3 years, 4 years into the field. And then a lot of growers will sample kind of late rotation, a couple of years before harvest, and try to make any adjustments so that the trees are nice and green right before they harvest. And so the idea of this chart here is that nutrient demand is really kind of an exponential sort of function, right? So the trees get larger, not only are they getting taller, they're getting wider, and all of that needle biomass, right, needs more nutrients to support. Okay, bit on a few of the elements. Nitrogen needed in the largest amounts. Is very mobile in the plant. Well, it's both negatively and positively charged. It will ultimately become negatively charged. It will ultimately become nitrate, which can ultimately be leached. So we want to be aware of that. We're gonna apply this throughout the rotation. I don't know about yearly. I think most people probably can get by with every 2 years. A number of different products, and it kind of depends on what you're trying to do. If you need other elements, so if you need phosphorus as well, you can use something like diammonium phosphate or DAP as your end source. If you don't need other things, urea is usually the cheapest form. The challenge with urea is it's subject to volatilization if you apply it during hot weather. So we typically recommend nitrogen additions or fertilizer additions about 2 weeks before bud break. Okay, so before things are getting ready to move, get that fertilizer out. The roots are probably already active. They're responding to soil temperature, independent of what's going on with your air temperature. And so we want to get that on there, get it dissolved in the soil solution, and then it also reduces the likelihood of volatilization because you're applying it when weather is still relatively cool. This is, I mentioned that we have a guide. This is kind of our take on things. And what we're doing here is looking at the relative nutrient demand of these species. Pines, if you're growing Scotch or white pine, and likely you would grow Scotch, but if you're growing white pine, they actually have relatively low nutrient needs. What we try to focus on is the amount of nitrogen per tree per year, okay? And so you're seeing here 1/4 to 3/4 of an ounce for Scotch and white pine, Douglas fir up here at the top. For Fraser fir, all of our firs, for spruces, you can see that we're ramping this up as the tree is getting bigger, that exponential curve we just showed you. As the trees are getting bigger, we're ramping up the amount of nitrogen that we're applying per tree per year until we get to harvest. And some growers like to add additional nitrogen for color, right? No debate if that's really effective or not. Let me skip ahead here. I know I'm running out of time. I just want to get to, and I'll include these in the handout that goes out. Just kind of hit the key points here again. Make sure that you know your soil pH, okay? Know your soil texture. Those are going to drive everything else. If your pH is out of whack, all bets are off. You're really going to be fighting water uphill. If you've got a 7.2 pH to start with, very few conifers are going to be happy with that regime. You've got to deal with that, or you're going to have issues throughout. And then texture is going to play a role. How much sulfur do I need to add? Well, what's your texture? First thing you're going to ask you. So check that out. Nitrogen, that's going to be based off of the tree species and size. Remember, nitrogen is dynamic in soil, not going to show up in your soil test. All the other elements, you're going to base your additions off of your soil test. If you go onto a Facebook page and what should I do with my fertilization, and anyone starts telling you to add triple anything, they don't know what they're talking about. Got it? Soil test, okay. Best always done pre-plant. That's where you can make your adjustments for your pH, get your phosphorus, your potassium in there if you need it. A lot easier to do it when there's nothing out there and you can disc it in and till it in, then wait till mid-rotation. Now how am I going to get phosphorus in these trees when any phosphorus I apply is going to sit there on the soil and take years to get down into the soil, okay? All right, I went a little over time, but hopefully enough time for a couple questions here. And I will look in the chat and see.
Yeah, it looks like we do have a question.
Yeah.
What is the best time of year
Yeah,
to
so the question, yeah, so
apply
best time to, yeah,
plant
best time to plant.
fertilizer around the tree?
Yeah, and it depends a little on what you're fertilizing with. Normally, I would say early spring, right? So we just talked about, a couple weeks before bud break. Sometimes if you need to add potassium, which can happen, oftentimes we'll use muriate of potash, so potassium chloride. And sometimes that's best done in the fall. And the reason for that is chloride can be a problem. So potassium chloride is a cheap and easy way to add potassium, but the chloride can be a problem. So if you apply that in the fall, what happens is the chloride portion is a negative charge, and so it can leach out with winter rain and snow melt if you have it. And so then that's one case where we might recommend the fall. But most cases we'd say early spring before bud break. Yep. So that's that. And then so when planting species that need different pH, how far apart do they need to be? Well, that's a challenge. I would say, your adjustments, you could, it depends on how if you're gonna adjust your pH, which you probably would have to if you're growing things that need different pH. If it's something where you're trying to keep it low for some of them, you could probably have them pretty close, assuming that you're doing your sulfur or other adjustments by hand, or maybe with a banding, like a Vicon, some kind of spreader that can band. You could have them fairly close together. If it's something where you're trying to lime for some, you would have to have that in an area where you could disc and get the lime incorporated. So a little bit of a logistical question, depending on how you're trying to manage the pH situation. If you're doing everything, if it's small scale and you're doing everything by hand, basically it's the root zone that you're trying to make your adjustments to. So you could have them fairly close together.
All right. We did have one more question that I'm going to ask just real quick earlier, and it was, we decided to defer it to you.
Okay.
Do you know of any cover cropping options that have the potential of lowering the pH of a soil?
Oh, cover crop to lower pH.
Very good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. Not sure. I think, most things we do, we usually think of in terms of just adding nutrients. So things like clovers and things like that, and organic matter. I'm not sure. I think things have less of an effect. If people talk about, pine needles lower pH and things like this. In fact, pines tend to grow where pH is low. And so people have kind of misinterpreted that pine needles lower pH. It's just that pines grow where the pH is low already. So I don't know that a crop really could lower the pH that much. I could be wrong. I think you're better off with sort of the tried and true and looking at, elemental sulfur. Your nitrogen regime by itself, if you're using urea, ammonium sulfate, any ammonium-based fertilizer is going to tend to acidify the soil over time in any event. So, yeah.
All right, sounds good. Well, thank you, Dr. Craig. We really appreciate you being here.
I got one more question on here. Question about deer. The best defense against deer. Well, a couple best defenses against deer. First one is deer fence. The other is dogs. If you have an area that is fenced in that you can let dogs run, they're very effective. Hunting was mentioned. Our Department of Ag will allow nuisance permits, so you can, but we have so many deer here in Michigan, you can't shoot them fast enough. So deer fence is really the best defense. There are differences in species preferences. Fraser is a preferred browse. Spruces tend to be less browsed. I've seen very good results. Jeff, actually, before me, Jeff Owen has done a lot of research on deer repellents. He's found very good results with a new product called Trico. It's actually rendered sheep fat, and it's shown very good results. So fencing is the best. Excluding them is really the best. Failing that, dogs can be very effective if it's appropriate. And then I think among the deer repellents, Trico seems to be very effective. The others, the plant skid and blood and dried egg and all that, have to be reapplied. So how often can you stand to be out there in the wintertime reapplying them? Okay, I'll let you go, Tara. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Just a couple things as we wrap up the webinar today. Cindy just dropped a link to the post-event survey. If you guys would please take the time to fill that out for me, it'll be very helpful. There's some questions on there that will only allow us to help you. So answer some things about how you want to receive future Christmas tree programming. What are some of the topics that you are most interested in learning more about? So follow that link, and it will also be included in the follow-up email after the event is over as well. So if you miss it now, it'll be in that email as well. The last thing that I am going to do is I dropped just now my email address into the chat. I realized I forgot to introduce myself at the very beginning. I'm Tara. I'm the state's Nursery Crops Extension Associate, and part of my job description includes working with Christmas trees. So if you guys have any questions, want to reach out, connect, my email address is there, and you can get me that way. And again, I want to thank the Kentucky Horticulture Council and Cindy, Dakota, and Bethany for helping put this webinar on. And we hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you.